Section 1. Welcome to Spooner Street. Picture a quiet street. The kind of street that sits perfectly still in the early evening. The kind where porch lights flicker on one by one as the sun dips below the horizon. Where the sound of a television drifts out through a window screen. Where someone somewhere is grilling something in a backyard you cannot quite see. Picture 31 Spooner Street. A two-story beige house in a fictional Rhode Island town with a neat enough lawn and a mailbox that always seems to be missing. A place where, if you walked past on a Tuesday afternoon, nothing would seem wrong. Nothing would seem strange. Nothing would suggest that the family inside that house is at the center of one of the most densely layered, quietly bizarre fictional universes ever constructed for a primetime animated comedy. That is the trick of it, really. Family Guy has been on television since January 31st, 1999, when it premiered to roughly 22 million viewers right after Super Bowl 33, making it one of the most watched debut episodes in animated television history. For most casual fans, it is a show about a big, round man who drinks too much, a talking dog who drinks slightly more refined things, a baby genius with a vendetta, and a family that probably should have sought therapy several seasons ago. But spend enough time with it, go deep enough into the episodes, sit with the lore long enough in the quiet hours of the evening, and something else starts to emerge. Patterns, questions, threads that begin in one episode and never quite get tied off, doors that open in one season and never close. Mysteries that the show itself occasionally nudges you toward as if daring you to ask. This is the thing that keeps you up, or rather the thing that is supposed to help you drift off tonight, because that is what this is. You are not here to analyze. You are not here to furiously scribble notes. You are here to let the world of Spooner Street wash over you, to let its strange logic settle around you like a comfortable fog, to follow the threads loosely the way you follow a dream just before it slips away. Every question we ask tonight does not need an answer. In fact, the ones without answers are often the most interesting. The ones where the show planted something and then just moved on, trusting that the right kind of person would notice. And you noticed. That is why you are here. So let us begin where all good explorations of this world begin. Not with a cutaway gag, not with a random flashback. Let us begin with the house itself, because the house on Spooner Street has a secret that the show took over a decade to fully reveal. And it is the kind of secret that quietly rewrites everything you thought you knew about where these people actually live. For the first several seasons, the house at 31 Spooner Street simply existed. The Griffins lived there. It was a fact of the universe. But in a season 2 episode called Missionary Impossible, the show casually dropped the information that Peter and Lois had purchased the home with a settlement from a lawsuit they filed against a condom company. Years later, that origin story would be quietly contradicted, with different episodes suggesting different financial histories for how the Griffins came to own their home. The show was never terribly interested in consistency for its own sake, and that is actually one of the things that makes it so fascinating to pull apart. The house is described in various episodes as having been paid for in at least 2 different ways, and nobody ever draws attention to the inconsistency. But here's the part that really opens things up. In a later episode, Peter discovers that the house at 31 Spooner Street is not actually registered in America. The land itself, the actual plot of Earth under the Griffin home, technically does not appear in any official city map. So what does Peter Griffin do with this information? He declares the property its own sovereign nation, which he names Pretoria, and appoints himself its president. He then annexes his neighbor Joe Swanson's swimming pool, which he renames Joe-hio, because of course he does. The whole arrangement eventually collapses, as Peter's arrangements tend to do, and the house gets absorbed back into the United States. But that episode, which is played entirely for comedy, accidentally reveals something remarkable. The Griffin home existed in a kind of legal gray zone. The place where all of this has been happening, the address you have been visiting every time you watched an episode, was, for a brief and canonized period, not technically part of the country it was sitting in. And that is before we get to the mountain paintings. There are two paintings visible behind the couch in the Griffin living room throughout most of the show's run. Most viewers walk right past them. They are just background details, set dressing, the kind of thing animation crews include to fill space. But in a season 18 episode, Stewie Griffin specifically identifies the mountain in those paintings as Mount Quahog. It is a fleeting throwaway line, but it was placed there deliberately. Someone on the writing staff knew that those paintings had been visible for roughly 17 seasons, and they put a name to the mountain in them. They built a small piece of geography around a background detail that had existed for almost 2 decades before anyone acknowledged it. That is Family Guy at its most quietly interesting. Not the big explosive jokes, not the cutaways that last 90 seconds, the tiny things. The things that sit in the background, waiting to be noticed. There is also the matter of the house's address itself. It is 31 Spooner Street, and if you look at a map of actual Cranston, Rhode Island, the city that served as the visual template for the fictional town of the show, you will find streets and neighborhoods that share a striking geography with the world depicted in the series. The show has always been set in Rhode Island deliberately, with creator Seth MacFarlane having attended Rhode Island School of Design, and drawing from that coastal New England atmosphere throughout the show's early years. The show's setting was never random. It was constructed from a real place, filtered through a particular creative vision, and then populated with the kind of characters who could only exist in fiction. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend enormous portions of their lives, has its own layered history that the show has returned to multiple times. In a season 2 episode, we see a flashback to the bar in the 1980s when it was called Street. Elmo's Clam, which is a reference to the electrical phenomenon and to the 1985 film St. Elmo's Fire. The bar existed before Peter and his friends. The bar had a life, a history, a set of regulars who came and went before the Griffins ever needed a place to drink. And then much later in the show, Horace, the bar's longtime owner, Giaz, and the friends are forced to scramble to save the clam from foreclosure. A place that had felt permanent and immovable suddenly revealed that it was just as fragile as everything else on Spooner Street. Tonight, we are going to move through every corner of this world, every character, every mystery, every thread that the show planted and then let drift. We will talk about the Griffin family and the secrets that sit quietly beneath their chaos. We will talk about Brian Griffin and the question of what exactly he is and why his death in season 12 raised questions that the show never fully answered. We will walk through the impossible depth of Stewie Griffin's history, his technology, his paradoxes, and the event in Season 9 that left fans genuinely uncertain about whether the Stewie they have been watching for years is actually the original. We will spend time with the neighbors, with the strange and shifting mythology of Spooner Street as a community. We will go deep into the chicken fights, which seem on the surface to be a running joke about a feud over an expired coupon, but which, when you lay every fight end to end and look at the destruction they leave behind, start to resemble something closer to a force of nature than a comedy bit. We will look at the hidden messages, the blink and you miss it newspaper headlines, the background details, the Easter eggs that the show's writers tucked into corners for the people paying attention. And we will explore the multiverse, the alternate realities that Stewie and Brian have visited, and what those universes suggest about the nature of the main universe and the strange reality the Griffins actually inhabit. All of it woven together gently. All of it told slowly, the way a good story should be told late at night, when there is nowhere to be and nothing to rush toward. Let the porch light stay on. Let the hum of something in the background be the ambient noise of a fictional Rhode Island street. You are already on your way to somewhere softer. There is one more thing to say about the town before we move deeper into it. The zip code of the fictional town, as established in a season 7 episode called Foxy Lady, is 00093. Real zip codes in Rhode Island begin with 028 or 029. A zip code starting with 000 does not exist in the official United States Postal Service system. The town, technically speaking, does not have a valid address in the national postal infrastructure. You cannot send a letter to this place. It is not, in the postal sense, a real location within America. This is either a careless detail or an extremely precise one. The town exists in a geographic space that is modeled on real Rhode Island, that references real Rhode Island geography and weather and culture, and yet occupies a zip code that places it outside the framework of official American geography. The town is here. It is also officially nowhere. The Griffin family lives at an address in a town with a zip code that the post office does not recognize, and the show has been telling you this since season 7 if you were paying close enough attention. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, where Peter spends his working hours, is a major employer in this town and a significant piece of its cultural identity. The brewery produces a beer that is presented as a beloved local staple, the kind of regional product that becomes part of a community's identity in the way that certain foods and drinks do, inseparable from the place that makes them. But the brewery also has a darker history that various episodes have sketched in. The conditions inside the brewery, the way workers are treated, the power dynamics between management and the people on the floor, these things surface in episodes that are primarily about something else and then retreat back into the background. Peter's relationship with the brewery is complicated by the fact that he genuinely loves beer, which means he loves the product he makes, which means his job aligns with his deepest recreational commitment in a way that few people achieve. Whether this is fortunate or whether it represents a particular kind of trap is another question the show does not stay with long enough to answer. The school that the Griffin children attend, James Woods Regional High School, deserves more examination than it usually gets. It is named after an actor who is a recurring character in the show, having appeared in a number of episodes in increasingly creative conflicts with Peter Griffin. The naming of a school after a living person who is also a character in the show is the kind of thing that seems, in isolation, like a simple joke. But James Woods, the character within this show, has a complicated history with the town. He has manipulated people in it, deceived residents, and been the subject of his own canon murder mystery in the season 9 premiere. The students of this town go to a school named after a man who has, within the show's history, been accused of multiple crimes and who was shot at the end of that premiere. There is a plaque somewhere in that school with his name on it, and if the students are paying attention, they are attending an institution that commemorates a character whose legacy in this community is at best ambiguous. The show established this naming early and then largely moved on from it, the way it moves on from most things. But the school exists. The children go there. Whatever the ongoing consequences of the James Woods naming decision are, they unfold off screen. In a part of this world the cameras never reach. This is the quiet mystery of the show's background. The things that are mentioned and then set down. The things that keep existing even when the episode has moved on. Let us begin. Hey, before we move on, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching this from and what time it is there. It genuinely makes our day reading every single one. And if you want to make sure you never miss a video like this, hit subscribe. It is completely free and it means everything to this channel. Now settle in. We have a long, quiet night ahead of us. Section 2. The Griffin Family. origins, bloodlines, and buried history. The Griffin family appears on the surface to be about as ordinary as a family with a supervillain baby and a talking dog can possibly be. Peter is large and loud, and mostly well-meaning. Lois is patient to a degree that suggests either exceptional emotional fortitude or some very specific coping mechanisms the show never fully explores. Meg is a teenager who wants to be anywhere else. Chris is an awkward, big-hearted kid who probably should be the most interesting character on the show and is consistently overlooked for it. And Stewie is Stewie, which we will get to at considerable length later. But the Griffin family has a history that goes back much further than 31 Spooner Street. It goes back centuries in the show, particularly in a season 5 finale episode called Untitled Griffin Family History. Took the time to map some of that history out. The episode is structured as a frame story in which the Griffins are trapped in a panic room after robbers break into their house, and Peter's mother Thelma fills the time by narrating the family's history, going all the way back to the beginning of the universe. What follows is one of the strangest and most densely packed pieces of world building in the show's history, told in a format that allowed the writers to essentially create a series of historical parody sketches connected by the thin tissue of Griffin DNA. In the world of the show, the Big Bang itself was caused by God lighting a fart with a lighter. From there, various ancestors of Peter Griffin appear throughout history in roles that seem almost cosmically designed to be the roles Peter Griffin would have played in any era. There is Peter, a caveman who invents the wheel during the Paleolithic Age. There is Moses Griffin, who in the show's version of events led the Israelites to freedom, with all of the chaos and poor decision-making that implies. There is Nate Griffin, the ancestor who was enslaved and brought to America, who in the show's framing managed to trick the captain of the slave ship in a way that speaks to the Griffin family's long tradition of chaotic improvisation in impossible situations. The Nate Griffin segment is particularly interesting from a continuity standpoint, because it establishes that an ancestor of Peter Griffin was enslaved by the Pewterschmidt family. The Pewterschmidts are Lois' family. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father and one of the wealthiest and most unpleasant recurring characters in the show, comes from a lineage that owned a plantation, and Nate Griffin fell in love with an ancestor of Lois on that plantation, which means Peter and Lois are not only husband and wife. They are also, in a historically horrifying and deeply uncomfortable way that the show acknowledges by leaning into rather than away from, the descendants of an enslaved man and the family that enslaved him who fell in love across that brutal divide. The show does not dwell on this. It moves through it quickly, the way it moves through most things. But it is there, embedded in the family's stated history, and once you have seen it, you cannot quite unsee it. The Griffins are not just a suburban Rhode Island family that stumbled into each other. They are, at least in the mythology the show constructed, connected by a history that stretches back through American slavery and into the deep past of a world that God apparently started with a lighter and poor judgment. Peter Griffin's actual father is another matter entirely. For most of the show's run, Peter believed his father was Francis Griffin, a deeply conservative Irish Catholic man who was hard on Peter, in the way that fathers on television are often hard on their sons, meaning constantly and with a kind of grim dedication to disappointment. But a season 4 episode revealed that Francis is actually Peter's stepfather. Peter's biological father is a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish wanderer who Peter eventually tracks down and visits in Ireland. This revelation should have been earth-shaking. In most shows, discovering your real father is the kind of thing that redefines a character's understanding of themselves. And Peter does go to Ireland, and he does meet Mickey, and there is a whole episode about it. But then Peter comes back, and Francis is still around until his eventual death. And the biological father storyline gets filed away quietly in the same drawer as several other potentially transformative revelations that the show introduces and then carefully forgets. That is the floating timeline at work. Family Guy has always operated on a logic where characters can have backstory altering moments in one episode and return to factory settings by the next. It is a creative choice that is simultaneously freeing and, for anyone tracking the continuity carefully, slightly maddening. Peter has a biological father in Ireland. He also had a stepfather who died and left him with a complicated grief. Both of these things are true. Both of them sit in the show's history. The show simply does not want you to hold them together at the same time. Lois Griffin's family history is equally rich and somewhat darker. Carter Pewterschmidt is old money in a way that implies generational wealth accumulated through means that do not bear too much examination. He is dismissive of Peter, controlling toward Lois, and has a temper that suggests a man who has never in his life been told no by anyone with the power to make it stick. In various episodes, Carter is revealed to have done things that would make a reasonable person question whether Lois grew up in a household or in a particularly well-appointed institution for the powerful and amoral. But Lois herself carries her own buried history. In season 2, the show revealed that Lois had a brother, Patrick, who had been locked away in a mental institution for years. The existence of an entire sibling that the family never mentioned, a sibling who turned out to be a serial killer of fat men, is the kind of revelation that most shows would build a season around. Family Guy introduces him, does an episode about him, and then sends him back to the institution. Patrick Pewterschmidt exists in the show's history as a confirmed serial killer related to Lois. He is out there somewhere in the world of the show, presumably still institutionalized, and the family basically never thinks about him again. Then there's the matter of Lois's pre-Peter romantic history, which the show has sketched in across various episodes, in ways that paint a picture of a young woman whose choices were considerably more interesting than her current domestic arrangement might suggest. There are references to a period of a wild abandon, to decisions made in youth that Lois is not always comfortable revisiting. The most dramatic of these is the reveal in a later season episode that before Lois became the devoted, if occasionally unsettled, wife and mother of 31 Spooner Street, she appeared in an adult film. The episode in which this comes out involves her old friend Joyce Kinney, who turns out to have been her college roommate, and who screens the film at their church. It is a comedy episode. But underneath the comedy is a genuinely interesting question about who Lois was before the show started, and whether the woman raising these children is the same person she would have become if her life had taken a different shape. Meg Griffin's place in the family history is unusual for a reason that goes beyond the mistreatment she receives in the later seasons. There are multiple moments across the show's run that hint at a genuine uncertainty about Meg's parentage. The most explicit version of this comes in a season 3 episode where Lois confesses to having had an affair, and the implication floats briefly that Meg's father might not be Peter. The show never commits to this fully. It raises the question and then lets it dissolve back into the episode's plot. But the suggestion sits there, in the dialogue, in the way the scene is structured. And it adds a layer to Meg's outsider status within the family that goes beyond the simple dynamic of a teenager who gets overlooked. What if Meg is not fully theirs? What if the distance between Meg and Peter, a distance that the show eventually weaponizes into a decade of increasingly cruel humor, has a biological explanation that neither of them is fully conscious of? This is speculation. The show never confirms it. But the show did put the question in the air, and questions in Family Guy, once raised, tend to linger. Chris Griffin is in some ways the most mysterious of the Griffin children because his mysteries are understated. He is the big, sweet, slightly oblivious son, the one who draws and who has a surprisingly sophisticated emotional intelligence in certain episodes. But his voice, provided by Seth Green, was deliberately modeled on the voice of Buffalo Bill, the serial killer from the 1991 film The Silence of the Lambs. The show acknowledged this connection directly in season 7, when Chris reenacted Buffalo Bill's disturbing mirror dance from the film. Most people who have seen that moment file it under strange humor and move on. But the decision to model a teenage boy's voice on a serial killer, and then to later have that teenager reenact the serial killer's most iconic scene, is the kind of creative choice that asks to be looked at more closely. Who is Chris Griffin, really, beneath the awkwardness in the art classes? The show never pushes this very far, but someone in the writing room thought it was worth noting the connection, and then kept noting it, and that suggests it meant something to them beyond a single joke. The Griffin House itself has secrets beyond its legal status as a sovereign nation and its unregistered address. The panic room that Peter apparently built into the house is one of them. A regular suburban house in a regular suburban neighborhood has, somewhere inside it, a small steel room equipped with television monitors capable of watching every room in the building. Peter Griffin built a surveillance system into his own home. He built it so secretly that his family apparently did not know about it until they ended up inside it together during a robbery. You can choose to read this as a simple comedy setup, and that is entirely valid. Or you can let that fact sit for a moment. Peter Griffin, who is frequently portrayed as barely capable of sequential thought, somehow managed to construct a covert surveillance room in his family home without anyone noticing. Either Peter is more capable than he appears, or someone helped him, or the house has a history that precedes the Griffins entirely. The show dropped this particular thread and walked away from it, the way it walks away from so many things. But Spooner Street is full of houses like this, full of people whose surfaces only gesture toward what might be underneath. Peter Griffin's employment history also raises questions that the show never pauses long enough to answer satisfactorily. He begins the show working at the happy-go-lucky toy factory, a job that fits his temperament and his skill level. But after a season or so, he transitions to a job at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, which is where he spends most of the show's run, working in a beer factory in a town in Rhode Island, with the kind of contentment that only a man who genuinely loves beer could feel about beer-adjacent employment. How this transition happened, why the toy factory went away, what specifically Peter does at the brewery in terms of an actual job function, these are all things the show is not terribly interested in explaining. Peter has a job at the brewery. He gets paid enough to support a family and a drinking habit. That is sufficient for the show's purposes. But the brewery itself, Pawtucket Patriot Ale, with its cheerful colonial-era mascot, has an entire history that gets occasionally explored in later episodes. The brewery is owned by a man named Pawtucket Pat, who appears in one particularly memorable episode modeled after the plot of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, with all the ominous implications that brings. The Griffin family exists at the intersection of its own biography and the universe's willingness to keep reshaping it. They are not consistent in the way that characters in a tightly plotted drama are consistent. They are consistent in the way that people you grew up around are consistent, which is to say that you recognize them immediately, but the more you know about them, the more you realize there are rooms in their history you have never been invited into. Spooner Street is full of those rooms, and one of them, located in the backyard of a house a few doors down from the Griffins, belongs to the man who is perhaps the most intellectually layered and personally complex character in the entire neighborhood. Not the smartest, not the most powerful, but the one whose mystery is, in many ways, the most human. The Talking Dog. Section 3. Brian Griffin. The Dog Who Knows Too Much. Brian Griffin is a white Labrador who walks upright, holds conversations, drives a Toyota Prius with a license plate reading BRI-DOG, nurses a dry martini with the precision of someone who has been doing it for decades, and has, over the course of the show's run, written a novel, developed a cocaine addiction, attended Brown University, served in the military, tried his hand at stand-up comedy, married a woman he met at a recovery meeting, fathered a child he initially abandoned, died, been mourned by millions of television viewers, and returned from the dead thanks to his infant best friend and a borrowed time machine. He is not a background character. He is not decoration. Brian Griffin is one of the most deeply constructed characters in Family Guy, which makes the questions surrounding him particularly interesting to sit with. Let us start at the beginning. Brian's origin story is told in a Season 2 episode, and it is one of the most genuinely affecting pieces of backstory the show ever produced. Brian grew up on a farm in Austin, Texas, as part of a normal dog litter. His mother was a standard, non-speaking dog named Coco. His father, who the show claims Brian never really knew, was a dog with what Brian describes as racist tendencies. When Brian was barely old enough to leave his mother, the family that owned the farm sold her, and Brian watched the car that contained his mother drive away down a dirt road. That image, a puppy watching the one person who loved him unconditionally disappear around a bend, is played with a tenderness that the show does not always reach for. It explains, in a way that nothing else quite does, why Brian drinks the way he drinks, why he reaches for connection and cannot quite hold on to it, why he has an emptiness at his center that martinis and literary ambitions and failed relationships never seem to fill. He eventually found his way to Rhode Island, and eventually to the Griffin family, and particularly to Peter, who found him on a street and brought him home. The specific mechanism by which a stray dog in Rhode Island ended up speaking fluent English, having opinions about books, and developing a palate for quality alcohol is something the show treats as not requiring an explanation. Brian simply is. The world of this show treats him as a human character who happens to also be a dog. And that social contract between show and viewer holds until you start pulling at the threads. Because here's where it gets interesting. Brian is acknowledged by the show to be both a dog and not a dog simultaneously. He pays taxes, he drives, he has romantic relationships with human women. He holds a lease on an apartment at one point. He has a social security number, presumably. He exists in the legal and social framework of the world around him as a functioning adult. And yet, when it serves the comedy, he also has dog instincts. He chases cars. He is distracted by squirrels. He has what is delicately referred to in one episode as dog behaviors that his human companions find embarrassing. The show uses both of these aspects of his nature depending on what the moment needs, and usually it does not invite you to reconcile them. You are meant to accept both versions of Brian in the same way you accept that babies in real life do not speak with refined British accents, and yet Stewie does. But here is the part about Brian that the show has never quite resolved, and that fans have spent years discussing in forums and comment sections and late-night conversations. It's exactly like this one. Who was driving the car that killed Brian in Season 12? The episode Life of Brian, which aired in November 2013 and became one of the most talked about moments in the show's long history, begins with Stewie destroying his time machine. He and Brian have been through too many dangerous adventures, too many close calls, and Stewie has decided that the risk is no longer worth taking. He smashes the machine. And then, within minutes of this decision, while they are setting up a street hockey net in the road outside the Griffin house, a car comes around the corner at speed and hits Brian. He is mortally wounded. The family rushes him to the emergency vet, and Brian Griffin, beloved character of 14 seasons of television, dies. The driver of that car is never identified, never seen clearly, never brought to any kind of accountability. There is a moment at Brian's funeral where Joe Swanson, a police officer, is asked whether anyone is looking into who did this, and the moment is played for a quick joke before moving on. But think about what that question actually points toward. A character was killed by a hit and run driver who was never found. And in a show where a police officer lives next door to the victim, nobody seems particularly motivated to investigate. In the episode, Stewie tries to rebuild his time machine to save Brian, but is unable to source the parts. He eventually gets a different time machine in the Christmas episode that follows, and uses it to travel back and intercept the moment before the accident, pulling Brian to safety before the car arrives. The car that originally killed Brian is still out there. In whatever version of the timeline that existed before Stewie's unwitting intervention, Brian died, was buried, and was mourned for roughly a month before his timeline was erased. In the restored timeline, the accident never happens, but the car that would have hit him still exists, its driver still exists, and the universe continues on with this unresolved near tragedy sitting just slightly out of frame. Who was it? The show never tells us. Fans have speculated endlessly. Some theories suggest it was someone with a motive, someone who knew about Stewie's time machine and had a reason to want Brian removed from the timeline. Other theories point to it being simply a drunk driver, the randomness of the event being the point, life ending without warning or narrative justification because that is what life does. But the show's decision to leave the driver's identity unresolved is itself a narrative choice. And in a show that usually resolves its plots within the episode, this hanging thread feels deliberate. Someone made a decision not to answer this question. That decision does not feel like carelessness. Brian's relationship with Stewie is one of the most genuinely complex relationships in animated television, and it is worth spending some time with because it contains several mysteries of its own. The two of them are, in many ways, the emotional core of the show. A talking dog and an evil baby genius who find in each other a kind of kinship that neither can quite find anywhere else. Brian understands Stewie in a way that the rest of the family does not. Stewie, who in the early seasons was largely incomprehensible to the adults around him, could be heard and understood by Brian when nobody else could. That connection, that singular ability to hear what someone is actually saying, forms the foundation of everything between them. There's an episode in Season 8 titled Brian and Stewie that is unlike anything else the show ever produced. Brian and Stewie are accidentally locked in a bank vault over a weekend. There are no cutaway gags. There are no other characters. There is no B-plot. It is 90% of a standard television episode spent entirely in a confined space with two characters who have nothing to do but talk to each other. And what comes out of that conversation is remarkable. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box at that bank. He keeps it because there are days when he thinks about using it on himself. He has been carrying this around quietly. Stewie, who by this point in the show has transformed significantly from his early seasons, sits with this information in a way that demonstrates genuine care. The episode is raw and uncomfortable and nothing like what Family Guy was supposed to be. The gun is still in that vault. The show never returns to it in any meaningful way, but it sits there in canon, in a safety deposit box somewhere in the fictional Rhode Island setting of this show, loaded and waiting. Brian Griffin owns a gun that he keeps specifically for the purpose of using on himself. He told his best friend about it in a moment of extraordinary honesty, and then the show moved on to the next episode. Most shows would never have put that in. Most shows, having put it in, would have built towards something with it. Family Guy did neither. It told you something true about a character and then trusted you to carry it forward on your own. Brian's son Dylan is another thread that the show opened and did not fully explore. In season 7, Brian discovers he has a biological son from a previous relationship, a teenage boy named Dylan, who has been raised by his mother in a difficult situation and who has turned out troubled and angry. The episode is one of the better character pieces in the show's post-revival run, and it ends on a genuinely warm note, with Brian and Dylan developing a real connection. And then Dylan essentially disappears from the show. He returns in a later episode or two, but never with the consistency that a character of his importance should have. Brian has a son. He established a relationship with that son. The son is out there in the world of the show, growing up, theoretically having a life that intersects with the world on Spooner Street. Where is Dylan? What happened to the connection they built? The show does not seem particularly interested in answering these questions, but they are there, and on a quiet night, they are the kind of thing that makes you realize just how many open endings the show has accumulated over its decades on the air. Brian's educational history is another piece of this puzzle. He attended Brown University, one of the most selective universities in the United States, though the show later reveals he dropped out one class short of graduating. The reasons for this dropout are never deeply explored. Brown University is an Ivy League institution in Providence, Rhode Island, which is to say it is extremely close to where the show is set. Brian could, at virtually any point, drive to Providence and finish his degree. He has never done this. He talks about his writing, his intellectual life, his aspirations toward being taken seriously as a thinker and a creator, and he possesses the academic background to support those aspirations, minus one class. One class that he has never, in all the years of the show, gone back to take. Why not? What happened in that last class? What made him stop one credit short of the finish line? The show gives you just enough to wonder and not enough to know. Brian's voice is, according to Seth MacFarlane in various interviews, essentially his own natural speaking voice. The man behind the character of Peter Griffin and Stewie Griffin and Glenn Quagmire, a man whose professional life is defined by voices, speaks Brian in his own register. There is something interesting about that creative choice. Brian, the most outwardly intellectual character on the show, the one who is meant to be the voice of reason, the one who reflects the world of the show back at itself with the most clarity, speaks in the voice his creator uses when he is not performing. Brian is not a character. Seth MacFarlane is playing. Brian is the version of Seth MacFarlane that shows up when the performance stops. Section 4. Stewie Griffin, the baby who built the universe. There's a moment in a season 9 episode called The Big Bang Theory that recontextualizes everything. Not just everything about Stewie, not just everything about Family Guy, but potentially everything about the nature of the universe in which this show takes place. And because this show has been running for over 2 decades, and because its writers have occasionally taken its mythology to places that feel almost genuinely philosophical in their implications, this moment deserves to be unpacked carefully. Here is what happens. Stewie's half-brother Bertram, who exists because of a previous episode in which Stewie ended up competing against his own sperm, in a storyline that you simply have to accept as a premise and move forward from, discovers that Stewie has a functional time machine. Bertram, whose ambitions run in a direction that would make early Stewie proud, decides that the most efficient way to defeat Stewie is to travel back in time and kill his ancestor. If Stewie was never born, he cannot build the time machine that is currently threatening Bertram, and the problem resolves itself. So Bertram travels to the late 15th century to find and kill Leonardo da Vinci, who he has identified as Stewie's ancestor. Stewie and Brian follow him back to stop this, and in the process, Stewie makes a discovery that he shares with Brian almost as a casual aside. It turns out that Stewie is his own ancestor. The chain of causation goes like this. Stewie discovered time travel. Stewie used time travel to go to the past. In the past, Stewie injected his own DNA into a woman connected to Leonardo da Vinci's family. This means that Stewie exists because Stewie traveled back in time and caused himself to exist. Without the time machine, Stewie would never have been born. Without Stewie being born, there would be no time machine to go back and cause his birth. The paradox is perfectly circular. But wait, there is more. The episode goes even further. It reveals through the logic of its own internal rules that because Stewie is the reason he himself was born, and because this act of temporal self-creation is woven into the fabric of the timeline, Stewie Griffin is in some sense the reason the universe itself continues to exist. If Bertram had killed Leonardo da Vinci before Stewie could intervene, not only would Stewie have been erased from existence, but the timeline would have collapsed entirely. The universe, as it exists in this show, requires Stewie to exist in order to persist. This is stated explicitly in the episode. Stewie is not just a baby genius on a television show. In the mythology of this television show, Stewie Griffin is cosmologically necessary. This is a remarkable thing to put in a primetime animated comedy and then more or less walk away from. The Big Bang Theory episode aired, fans engaged with it was generally well received, and then the show continued on. Stewie kept having adventures. Stewie kept building gadgets. Stewie kept having complicated feelings about his friendship with Brian and his complicated relationship with his sexuality and his place in his family. None of the episodes that followed particularly paused to acknowledge that the baby in the yellow shirt is, according to the show's own internal logic, the linchpin of causality itself. But it is there. It is canon. And it colors every other scene in the show with a particular quality of light once you have seen it. Stewie's technology deserves its own extended exploration, because the things he has built in his bedroom represent a level of scientific achievement that, even by the standards of a cartoon that regularly does absurd things, is genuinely staggering. The list includes, but is not limited to, a fully functional time machine that can travel to any point in history and return with precision, a multiverse transporter capable of jumping between parallel realities, a working teleportation device modeled on the one from Star Trek: The Next Generation, a shrinking pod capable of reducing a person to microscopic scale, a mind control device that has actually worked on multiple characters in the show, weather control technology, a cloning machine, a genetic engineering apparatus capable of producing an entirely separate version of himself with distinct personality traits, a jetpack, and an unspecified number of conventional and unconventional weapons, including laser guns, rocket launchers, and crossbows. This technology sits in a bedroom in a house in Rhode Island that is owned by a man who barely understands how television remote controls work. The contrast is the joke, and in the early seasons, it is a consistently excellent joke. But the existence of this technology also raises a question that the show is careful to never ask directly. Where does Stewie get the materials? Where does he source the plutonium for early versions of the time machine? How does a one-year-old baby with no independently verified income stream fund a research and development operation that would make national laboratories envious? The show has addressed some of this obliquely over the years. Stewie has money. He has accounts. In various episodes, he is revealed to have investments, offshore arrangements, resources that exceed what any member of his immediate family would expect to have access to. The implication across the show's run is that Stewie has been quietly accumulating financial resources for some time, using his intelligence to navigate a financial system that does not know it is being operated by an infant. This is consistent with who Stewie is, but it also raises questions about who he was doing business with. Someone was selling plutonium to a baby. Someone was supplying the parts for a time machine to what appeared to be a household in a mid-tier Rhode Island suburb. The supply chain for Stewie's operation is as mysterious as the operation itself. There is also the matter of Stewie's birth. The show has revisited this moment in various episodes, and it contains its own set of anomalies. We know from flashbacks that Stewie was plotting world domination before he was born. A cutaway in a Season 3 episode shows Stewie in the womb, already strategizing, already treating his eventual emergence into the world as the first step in a larger plan. He describes his time in the womb as being trapped in an ovarian bastille, which is both one of the best jokes the show ever wrote and a reminder that for Stewie, consciousness and ambition preceded literally everything else. Then there is the matter of his birth being reversed. In a Season 10 episode called Yug Alemaf, a malfunction with Stewie's time machine causes time to flow backwards. Among the many things this reversal affects is Stewie's birth, which essentially unhappens and then happens again. Stewie was born twice according to the show's canon. The implications of this for his continuity as a person are something the show does not pause to examine, but the fact of it sits in the record. The baby who is cosmologically necessary to the continued existence of the universe was born, reversed, and born again. And then there's the moment that fans have discussed more than almost any other moment in the show's history. In a Season 9 episode called The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair, Stewie tries to rebuild his own evil tendencies by constructing a machine that will amplify his malicious nature. The machine malfunctions, and instead of amplifying Stewie, it creates a perfect clone of him. The clone, which the episode calls Evil Stewie, and fans have taken to calling Iwitz, has all of the original Stewie's dark qualities concentrated and intensified. He is ruthless, sadistic, and genuinely dangerous in a way that the later, softer Stewie rarely is anymore. The episode builds to a confrontation, and eventually Brian has to choose which Stewie to shoot. He devises a test. Both Stewies are asked to look at their feet. The real Stewie, as established earlier in the episode, finds his own feet inexplicably amusing. He will laugh at them essentially on demand. The other one does not understand why feet are funny, and asks why he is being asked to look at his feet. Brian shoots the one who does not understand the feet test, presuming it to be the clone. But here's the thing, in the final shot of that episode, after Brian has walked away believing he has eliminated the threat, the surviving Stewie turns to the camera. His eyes are yellow. Cat eyes. Glowing in the dark. The music that plays is lifted from the end of Michael Jackson's Thriller video. The implication hangs there like smoke in a room. Did Brian get it right? The show has never confirmed this one way or another. The Stewie who has appeared in every subsequent episode exhibits behavior that is broadly consistent with the pre-cloned Stewie, but the seeds of doubt were planted deliberately. Someone wrote that ending. Someone animated those yellow eyes. The Thriller reference is not accidental. It is a piece of horror grammar placed at the end of a comedy episode to suggest that something might be off, that the creature that was saved might not be the creature that should have been saved, that the thing in the yellow shirt and red overalls smiling at Brian over breakfast might have a layer underneath the warmth that Brian has never been able to see. Stewie's relationship with Lois is one of the defining dynamics of the show's earliest seasons and one of its most carefully managed slow burns. In the pilot episode, the show establishes clearly that Stewie wants his mother dead. His matricidal desires are not metaphorical, not the expression of a complicated family bond taken to absurd extremes for comedy. He has actual plans. He builds actual weapons. He spends actual screen time in the first season attempting to carry out her murder and being foiled by circumstances. The reason for this, as explained in the pilot, is that Lois spends a great deal of time inadvertently interfering with Stewie's plans for world domination. She is always there, wanting him to eat, wanting him to sleep, wanting him to behave in age appropriate ways that are essentially incompatible with being a supervillain. From Stewie's perspective, the most efficient path to world domination runs through the elimination of his chief obstacle, which is his mother. This is villainous logic applied to domestic routine, and it is one of the purest comedy concepts the show ever built. Eyes. The season 6 two-part episode, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, is widely regarded as the swan song for this version of Stewie. It is a genuinely exciting and dramatically satisfying pair of episodes, in which, in the first part, Stewie actually does it. He kills Lois, or appears to. She falls off a cruise ship after a confrontation with Stewie, and the second part opens a year later in a world where Stewie has successfully taken over and is now running the country with the cold efficiency his plans always promised. He has agents, he has authority, he has resolved the chicken or the egg problem of ambition that defined his first few years. And then Lois comes back. She survived the fall. She has spent a year recovering and building toward her return. And the showdown that follows is exactly what 6 seasons of build-up deserved. And then, right at the climax, the show pulls the curtain back. Everything you just watched was a simulation. Stewie was running it on his computer, playing out scenarios. None of it happened. The reset button is pressed. Lois is alive. The world domination plots continue for a little while longer, and then they fade, and then they are largely gone. The show explained this away as the writers feeling they had taken the joke as far as it could go. But for fans of that original Stewie, those episodes feel less like a creative decision and more like a funeral. Stewie's time travel adventures with Brian represent one of the great unexplored frontiers of the show's mythology. The two of them have visited World War II Germany, various periods of American history, parallel versions of the present, and multiple alternate timelines created by their own interference with history. The episode Road to Germany establishes that Stewie's time machine can be powered by uranium, and the episode involves the three of them, Stewie, Brian, and their neighbor, Mort Goldman, who accidentally wandered into the machine, traveling to 1939 Germany to retrieve a return pad and barely escaping the historical catastrophe unfolding around them. The moral weight of that episode, which is essentially 3 characters bumbling through the lead up to the Holocaust with characteristic Family Guy energy, sits in an unusual place. It is played for comedy, but the backdrop is so heavy that the comedy has to work harder than usual to hold the frame. Stewie has also been to the future in various episodes and cutaway glimpses. What the show reveals about who he becomes in the futures it is shown is inconsistent and deliberately unhelpful. In some futures, Stewie grows up to be exactly what you might expect, brilliant and accomplished, and still carrying that particular sense of his own importance. In others, the implications are darker. The show has never committed to a canonical future for Stewie, and perhaps it does not need to. Perhaps the most honest thing it can say about him is that his future is genuinely undetermined, that a child with a time machine and cosmic significance and the ability to rewrite his own history has an unusually open set of possible trajectories. What we know is what we have seen. A baby who built a universe. A baby who saved his best friend from death. A baby who stood on a balcony with a sniper rifle in the season 9 premiere and made the shot that saved his mother, the same mother he spent 6 seasons trying to kill. That moment, when Stewie shoots Diane Simmons to prevent Lois from being killed, is a summary of everything that happened to this character between season 1 and season 9. He traded matricide for protection. He turned the weapon outward towards someone who threatened the woman he had, despite everything, come to love. Whether that is growth or just a more sophisticated version of control is, like most things about Stewie Griffin, a question the show leaves for you to answer in the quiet. Section 5. The Neighbors. Joe, Quagmire, and the Mysteries of Spooner Street. Spooner Street is an unusual place to live, in the way that a geological fault line is an unusual place to build a city. The houses look fine, the lawns are maintained, the mailboxes stand in more or less their correct positions. But the people inside those houses have histories and behaviors that would, if any of them had the misfortune of being subjected to genuine scrutiny, raise questions that a normal neighborhood could not comfortably contain. Glenn Quagmire is the show's most internally contradictory character, and that contradiction is part of what makes him interesting in a way that a lesser show might not be able to sustain. He is introduced early in the series as a pickup artist, a pilot who approaches his romantic life with a dedication and a catalog of techniques that the show treats as a running joke about masculine shallowness. But over the course of the show's run, Quagmire accumulates enough backstory to constitute an entire biography. And several elements of that biography do not fit easily into the comedy frame the show wants to keep him in. His sister Brenda appears in a season 10 episode, and the storyline involves her being in an abusive relationship with a man named Jeff, who is genuinely threatening. The episode handles this with an unusual degree of directness, exploring what it feels like to watch someone you love refuse to leave a situation that is hurting them. Quagmire, who in almost every other episode of the show is treated as a comic figure whose moral standing is precarious at best, becomes something close to a hero in this episode. He feels his sister's pain. He tries to protect her. The episode ends in a way that is darker and more definitive than Family Guy usually allows itself to be. And for a few minutes, Quagmire feels like a complete person rather than a collection of running jokes. His history is scattered across various episodes in pieces that do not always add up cleanly. He was born in the 1950s, according to one storyline, which would make him extraordinarily old by the time the show is set. He has an unusual number of children from an unusual number of encounters, several of whom have appeared in later episodes to varying comic and dramatic effect. His actual name, the full legal version, is Glenn Quagmire, but the show has occasionally played with the suggestion that Quagmire himself is not entirely sure of certain biographical facts. Joe Swanson is, in some ways, the member of the friend group whose backstory is most carefully constructed. He is a police officer who uses a wheelchair following an injury that the show initially describes as occurring on Christmas Eve during a confrontation with a criminal he describes only as the Grinch. He stopped the Grinch from robbing an orphanage on Christmas, slid off a roof while pursuing him, injured his spine, and ended up in the wheelchair. This story is presented straightforwardly in his introductory episode in Season 1. It is the kind of backstory that gives a character moral weight, a heroic sacrifice that explains both his disability and his resolve. And then, several seasons later, the show quietly revealed that the Grinch story was not entirely true. The actual account of how Joe was paralyzed, when it eventually surfaces, involves an undercover operation and a drug lord named Bobby Briggs, whose operation Joe had infiltrated. Joe's cover was blown, and he was shot in the legs. The injury was not a heroic tumble off a roof while saving orphans from a Christmas villain. It was a gunshot wound in a narcotics investigation that went wrong. Joe eventually gets his revenge on Briggs in a dedicated episode that functions as a proper resolution to this long-running thread. But the gap between the Christmas story and the real story is interesting in what it says about how Joe presents himself and what he chooses to let people know. The show also deploys Joe's disability with a casualness that occasionally reveals how carefully it was thought through. His upper body strength is consistently portrayed as exceptional, which makes practical sense for someone who has lived in a wheelchair for years and has built his life around working with what he has. He can outfight almost anyone when the situation requires it. He has won physical confrontations against multiple armed opponents despite being unable to use his legs. And yet the show also uses his disability as a source of comedy in ways that range from the affectionate to the uncomfortable, depending on which season you were in and which writers happen to be in the room that week. Joe exists in this dual space where he is simultaneously one of the most capable characters on the show and the character most frequently defined by his limitation. His marriage to Bonnie is one of the show's longest running ongoing storylines, and it is also one of its most quietly bleak. Bonnie was pregnant, visibly and noticeably, for 8 full seasons before finally giving birth to their daughter Susie. 8 seasons. In real-world time, that represents roughly 8 years of the show acknowledging that this woman is pregnant and then not doing anything about it. There are jokes in the show that acknowledge the absurdity of this timeline, but there is also a genuine weirdness to it, the sense that something in the universe of this show was holding its breath around Bonnie Swanson, unwilling to let her situation resolve. When Susie finally arrived, in a season 9 episode titled Ocean's 3.5, the show treated it with appropriate warmth. But the 8 years of unresolved pregnancy hang over that arrival like a strange ambient pressure, as if the universe had been waiting to see what would happen and had simply decided quite some time ago that it was not ready to find out. Bonnie herself is, in the later seasons, revealed to have more complexity than her early appearances suggested. There are storylines where she is unhappy in her marriage, where she considers infidelity, where she pushes back against the dynamic that has her functioning primarily as Joe's caretaker. These storylines are often introduced and then abandoned, but they do establish that Bonnie Swanson has an inner life that runs parallel to the life we see on screen, and that inner life has its own frustrations, desires, and uncertainties. Cleveland Brown's time on Spooner Street ended when he left for Virginia in the spin-off series The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. His departure was announced in a season 8 episode via the simple method of having Cleveland tell his friends he was leaving and then walking out the door. He eventually returned in a season 13 episode that acknowledged his absence with the show's characteristic blend of affection and humor. But during his absence, the friend group on Spooner Street had to reconfigure itself, and the show introduced Jerome as a replacement figure who occupied the same structural role in the group without having any of Cleveland's history with Peter. Cleveland's return was not treated as a grand event. He just came back, and the show simply resumed, including him as if he had been away on a long trip rather than the star of his own network television program for 4 years. This is the floating timeline at its most aggressive. A character was absent for multiple in-show years, was the protagonist of his own spin-off series, had an entire second life in another state, and returned to Spooner Street as though the chief obstacle had been a scheduling conflict rather than a creative and commercial decision to give him his own show. The house at the end of Spooner Street, set slightly apart from the others, belongs to the man whose backstory is arguably the most affecting, and whose presence in the neighborhood raises questions that the show deliberately chooses not to answer. John Herbert, known throughout the neighborhood simply as Herbert, is an elderly man in a motorized wheelchair with a voice that sounds like something dragged slowly across a wire. He is a veteran of World War II, a fact that a season 6 episode called German Guy explores with surprising depth, revealing that Herbert was captured by the Germans and sent to a concentration camp because the soldiers found photographs of young boys in his wallet. In that same episode, Herbert encounters Franz Schlecknacht, the German prison camp commander who oversaw his captivity. And in a physical confrontation that takes the logic of the episode to its extreme conclusion, Herbert, the old man in the wheelchair, defeats his former captor. The episode is not entirely comfortable to watch. but it does something that most of Herbert's appearances do not attempt, which is to give him a history that explains without excusing what he has become. He survived something that most people did not survive. He carried that survival into decades of a life that moved in a particular direction. The show does not ask you to find his behavior acceptable, but it does ask you to understand that people who do things that are difficult to understand often arrived at those behaviors through paths that were themselves difficult to survive. Herbert has appeared in episodes across many seasons, always living on the periphery of the Griffin family's chaos, always in that wheelchair, always with his dog Jesse beside him. His age is never specified in a way that would make arithmetic fully work, which is perhaps deliberate. He exists slightly outside the normal accounting of time on Spooner Street, the way old houses in real neighborhoods sometimes seem to exist slightly outside the logic of everything around them, as if they predate the neighborhood and will outlast it, and everything that has happened in between is simply something they have observed without being changed by. Section 6. The town itself. Strange geography and unexplained phenomena. The fictional city of this show is a place that has been built up across more than 2 decades of episodes into something with real geographical specificity, cultural texture, and a recurring cast of secondary characters who collectively make up a community that is more vivid than most fictional towns in American television history. It is modeled on Cranston, Rhode Island, which sits in the Providence metropolitan area, and the New England sensibility of the setting is baked into the show's aesthetic in ways that never entirely go away, even when the stories take the characters to other parts of the world. The town has a history that predates the modern era, as the show has explored in various episodes. In a season 7 episode called Peter's Progress, the show goes back to 17th century England and establishes that an ancestor of Peter named Griffin Peterson was exiled to the New World after falling out of favor with his king. Griffin Peterson ended up in Rhode Island, founded the town that would eventually become the place we know, and won the right to name it in a talent show against the king. This is presented as the canonical founding story of the town and the world of the show, which means that the community Peter Griffin currently lives in is named after an ancestor of Peter Griffin's, who won a talent show against a monarch. The Drunken Clam is more than just a bar. Over the course of the show's long run, it has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, has burned down at least once, has been temporarily converted into an English pub in one episode that the regulars actively fought against, has survived the death of its longtime owner, Horace, and has served as the setting for some of the most important conversations and decisions in the show's history. The show has returned to the founding of the Clams Bar multiple times, including the revelation that in the 1980s it was called St. Elmo's Clam, and in various alternate timelines or possible futures, the bar takes different forms or ceases to exist entirely. In the apocalyptic universe visited during the multiverse episode, the clam is abandoned and in ruins, a physical marker for how completely that world has fallen apart. The town has a newspaper, a news station anchored by Tom Tucker, and occasionally by Diane Simmons before her canon death in the season 9 premiere, a mayor in the memorable form of Adam West who played a version of himself until his real-life death in 2017, a hospital staffed by the perpetually questionable Dr. Elmer Hartman, a pharmacy run by the Goldman family, and a high school named James Woods Regional High School, which is named after the actor James Woods, who appeared in multiple episodes as a highly exaggerated version of himself, and whose name was put on the school as part of a deal related to an episode in which he was either the villain or the victim, depending on your perspective. That Mayor West, played by the actual Adam West, served as the town's mayor for most of the show's run, is one of the more quietly surreal recurring elements of the series. Adam West. The actor was asked to play a character named Adam West the Mayor, a character whose behavior was wildly different from anything the actual Adam West represented, but whose name was entirely his own. The mayor was eccentric to a degree that would have been medically interesting in real life, prone to statements that operated on a logic entirely his own, and frequently funnier than any other character in whatever scene he appeared in. When Adam West died in June 2017, the show eventually addressed his absence with a memorial episode that paid genuine tribute to the man and to the character he had given so much of himself to. The town's geography has never been entirely consistent, which is a feature rather than a bug for a show like this. Streets appear and disappear based on story needs. Distances between locations flex to serve the plot. The Griffin home is established as being on Spooner Street, and the specific address of 31 is sued consistently, but the neighborhood around it has shifted and expanded and contracted across seasons in ways that suggest the town itself is slightly fluid at its edges. One of the more fascinating recurring phenomena in the town is the question of what happens to the people who die there. The show has killed off a number of named characters across its run, and the rules governing which deaths stick and which do not are, to put it charitably, inconsistent. The season 9 premiere, the episode that borrowed its premise from Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, was specifically declared by Seth MacFarlane to be canon, meaning that the characters who died in it, including Diane Simmons and Muriel Goldman, were genuinely dead and would not return. This declaration was unusual for the show because most character deaths up to that point had been treated as reversible through whatever mechanism the next episode required. James Woods was shot in that same premiere, but was later explained to have survived through the mechanism of a secret science lab for celebrities that revived him. This particular explanation raised more questions than it answered. There is a secret science lab for celebrities that can revive people from gunshot wounds. This lab exists in the same town as 31 Spooner Street. The Griffins have never found it. James Woods, who is a character in the show rather than simply himself, was apparently known to this lab and was worth the investment of revival. What else has this lab been doing? Who else has passed through it? The show mentioned it in a single line and never came back to it. Death himself, the personification of mortality in the show's universe, appears as a recurring character in several early seasons. He has a scythe. He wears the robe. He also, as revealed in various episodes, gets drunk at parties, is susceptible to peer pressure, can be made to feel guilty, and, on at least one occasion, was willing to make time-related deals with Peter Griffin that he arguably should not have been willing to make. Death in the world of the show is an entity with feelings, capable of embarrassment and enthusiasm and social awkwardness. He drives a car. He was killed and replaced by a new death at some point. The mechanics of mortality in this universe are thus revealed to be managed by a being who is himself not exempt from the processes he administers, which raises the interesting question of what happens when death requires someone to die. Who does that job? Who stands at the end of the road when the road ender runs out of road? The show also has a version of God. God appears in several episodes, is male, has a beard, watches television, makes poor decisions, and was, according to one episode, responsible for the Big Bang via a lighter and a biological process that the show found extremely funny. God in this universe is omnipotent, but also somewhat distracted. The kind of deity who built everything and then got interested in other things and checks back in occasionally when something catches his attention. He went on a date with Meg Griffin in one episode. He attended various social events where characters ran into him and were surprised by how casual the encounter felt. The god of the show is not terrifying or inscrutable. He is present in a way that is almost more unsettling than the alternative, because a distant, incomprehensible god is at least coherent in his distance. A God who watches the same television shows you watch and goes on blind dates is a different kind of theological puzzle entirely. Section 7, Meg Griffin, the most mysterious character of all. There is a theory that floats through online discussions of Family Guy, one of those ideas that begins as a fan interpretation, but eventually gains enough traction and enough supporting evidence from the show itself that it starts to feel like something the writers might have intended, or at least something they were willing to leave room for. The theory is simple in its statement and profound in its implications. Meg Griffin is not ordinary. She is not the boring one. She is not the character the show keeps around to absorb cruelty because the writers cannot think of anything else to do with her. Meg Griffin is the load-bearing wall of the Griffin family, and without her, the structure collapses. The clearest evidence for this comes from the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, the one where the family is trapped inside during a hurricane and Meg finally says everything she has been holding back. She addresses each family member in turn, laying out precisely what they are and what they have done and what it has cost her. It is a remarkable piece of writing, the show doing something it almost never does, which is stopping the comedy entirely and letting a character speak the full weight of their experience. The audience watching this episode had spent years watching Meg be mistreated, and the speech functions as a release valve for that accumulated discomfort. For a moment, Meg is not a punchline. She is a person. But then comes the end of the episode where Meg goes to Brian and takes it all back. She explains that the family needs her to be the target, that without her absorbing the dysfunction, the family will turn on each other as they have just done in the aftermath of her speech. Meg Griffin makes a choice to return to her role, voluntarily, because she understands that her family cannot survive without someone in that position. This is not an episode about a character who accepts mistreatment because she has been broken into accepting it. This is an episode about a character who understands the system she lives in with complete clarity and chooses, with open eyes, to maintain it. Meg Griffin is not a victim who lacks self-awareness. She is the character with the most self-awareness on the entire show. She knows what she is doing. She knows what it costs. She does it anyway, because the alternative is the destruction of something she has decided is worth protecting. You can disagree with her choice, but you cannot say she does not understand the situation she is in. Think about what this means for the show's entire treatment of Meg across 20-plus seasons. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment where the family fails awes her. All of it is witnessed by a person who has essentially agreed to be the shock absorber because the machine would break down without one. Meg is not the forgotten Griffin. Meg is the one doing the work that nobody else can do. The theory goes further. It suggests that Meg's social difficulties at school, her inability to fit in, her persistent outsider status in every context, are not failures of her personality or her appearance. They are symptoms of something that is happening to her, a displacement of negative energy that the family unit produces, and that Meg then carries into every other space she inhabits. The family treats her as the repository for everything they cannot face about themselves. She absorbs it, and she takes it with her, and it marks her. In this reading, the bullying at school and the contempt at home are not separate phenomena. They are the same phenomenon operating at different scales. The show has it in the later seasons occasionally step back from the most extreme versions of Meg's mistreatment and given her episodes where she is capable and strong and surprising. In the crossover episode with The Simpsons, Meg meets Lisa Simpson, and the two of them form a genuine bond around shared intelligence and shared experiences of being overlooked by their respective families. Meg plays the saxophone brilliantly. She is an athlete. She has skills and talents that the show spent many seasons refusing to acknowledge, and their occasional surfacing feels like the show trying to correct a debt it knows it accumulated. There is also the matter of the fan theory that Meg is beneath everything the show does to her, actually the most normal and most functional member of her immediate family. She has normal teenage goals. She wants connection. She wants to be seen. She processes her emotions in ways that, while sometimes extreme, have a grounded logic to them. She adapts to circumstances that would break most people. She has a resilience that the show treats as comedy material, but that, if you frame it differently, looks a great deal like strength. The question of Meg's parentage, which was raised early and never resolved, adds another layer to this. If Meg is biologically different from the other Griffin children, if she came from a different father, then her outsider status in the family has a dimension that none of them may be consciously aware of. The father who treats her worst may do so partly because of something he senses but cannot name, a distance that he experiences as rejection and responds to with cruelty rather than curiosity. This is not an exoneration of that behavior, but it is a possible explanation for why the mistreatment has been so specifically targeted at Meg rather than distributed evenly across the children. One of the most interesting details about Meg's character is the fact that she has had two different voice actresses. Lacey Chabert voiced her for the first season, and Mila Kunis has voiced her from the second season onward. Most fans are aware of this transition, but few have thought about what it might mean in the world of the show. Narratively, Meg is the same person in both seasons. The change is a production decision, an actor leaving a role and being replaced. But in a show that has occasionally been willing to acknowledge its own production history in meta jokes, the fact that Meg alone among the Griffin family had this kind of transition is worth noting. Stewie does not have a different voice. Peter does not have a different voice. Only Meg, the character whose identity is most uncertain, whose place in the family is most contested, whose history is most layered, had a moment where she was, in some sense, someone else. Mila Kunis does not even provide Meg's singing voice. That is handled by Tara Strong, a veteran voice actress. So when Meg sings, she is voiced by a third person entirely. The character whose visual identity is most consistent is, in audio terms, the most plural. She is multiple people simultaneously, at least from the production side of things. And there is something in that multiplicity that rhymes with the theory about who Meg actually is in the story. Section 8. The Chicken Fights. What are they really about? In a fictional Rhode Island town, a heavyset man in his 40s and a giant anthropomorphic chicken have been fighting each other since the year 2000. Their battles have destroyed city blocks, derailed trains, crashed planes, brought down buildings, consumed enormous stretches of public and private property, and generated casualties among bystanders that, if tallied across every encounter, would represent one of the most destructive events in the history of this particular suburban community. The feud began over an expired coupon. This is the official explanation, provided in a Season 2 episode called Da Boom, which establishes that Ernie the Giant Chicken gave Peter Griffin a coupon that turned out to have passed its expiration date. Peter, presumably inconvenienced by this, responded with violence. Ernie responded to that violence with greater violence. The first fight was thus initiated, and the two of them have been at it ever since, occasionally reconciling, occasionally discovering new reasons to restart, but always returning to this fundamental dynamic of a man and a chicken who cannot be in each other's presence without destroying everything around them. The thing about these fights is that they are not random. There is a logic to them, a consistency of behavior on both sides that suggests something deeper than simple aggression. Peter and Ernie always find each other. It does not matter where Peter is or what he is doing. If Ernie appears, the fight begins and everything else stops. The fight takes priority over whatever was happening in the episode before it. It is as if the two of them are operating under a compulsion that neither fully controls. They are drawn together. They destroy. They separate. They recover. They find each other again. This is not normal cartoon violence. The scale and consistency of these encounters, which have taken place across more than 2 decades of television, suggests that something more than a grudge over a piece of promotional material is operating here. Fans have proposed various theories, ranging from the practical to the metaphysical. The most interesting of these theories suggests that the chicken fights represent the parts of Peter Griffin's life that he cannot process through normal channels. Every time something in Peter's emotional life reaches a point that would require genuine reflection, the chicken appears. The fight happens, the destruction occurs, and then Peter walks back to wherever he was, battered and unchanged, but somehow ready to continue. In this reading, Ernie is not a character. Ernie is a mechanism. He is the thing that happens to Peter instead of growth. The expired coupon that started it was never really the issue. The issue is that Peter Griffin carries things he never examines. And sometimes what you carry long enough finds a form it can express itself through. Ernie himself has a personal life that the show has sketched in across various appearances. He has a wife named Nicole, who is also a giant chicken. He has a son. He has a family. He is not simply a fighting machine who exists solely to be Peter's adversary. He has domestic concerns. He goes to dinner. He makes reservations at restaurants and insists on paying the check. The fight that happens in the Season 9 episode Lethal Weapons, in which the two of them sit across from each other at a restaurant table and Ernie tries to make peace, only for the tension to snap back into violence when both of them insist on footing the bill, is one of the most perfect distillations of what these encounters are really about. It is not anger. It is stubbornness. It is two entities whose natures make genuine peace impossible even when both parties nominally want it. Ernie is effectively immortal, at least within the logic of the show's action sequences. He has been stabbed, drowned, had his head bashed in with a frying pan, been propelled through an airplane propeller, survived explosions, fallen from enormous heights, been apparently roasted alive, and woken up from each of these experiences with his leg moving into a fist. He does not die. The show has used this immortality as a running visual joke, the body that turns out to be still alive, but it also raises a genuine question about what exactly Ernie the Giant Chicken is. If he cannot die, if physical trauma that would end any normal being simply delays him, what is he? Is he supernatural? Is he something the show's universe produced to serve a specific function? A force of nature wearing a chicken's body? The show does not engage with these questions directly, but the pattern of his survival is too consistent to be accidental. One of the most remarkable chicken fight sequences takes place in a season 14 episode and involves Peter accidentally backing into Ernie's car. This seemingly minor inciting incident escalates into a fight that somehow leads them both onto Stewie's time pad, where they fight across multiple time periods, ending up in a genetics lab and eventually in space before crashing back to Earth. The universe's most sophisticated technology, a time machine built by a baby genius that has been used to alter the course of history, is deployed here as a prop in a physical comedy sequence about two beings who got annoyed with each other in a parking lot. And somehow this does not feel out of place. The chicken fights operate on a scale that absorbs whatever the universe puts in their path. One of the time-based chicken fight sequences, in which Stewie's broken time machine causes events to play in reverse, features the fight happening backward in a way that reveals its underlying architecture with unusual clarity. Watching it in reverse, you see the choreography, the precision of the destruction, the way each beat of the violence follows from the previous one with the logic of inevitability. The fight, when reversed, does not look random. It looks designed, like something that was always going to happen this way, like a mechanism that is executing a function it was built to perform. The season that Ernie brought his entire chicken league to the drunken clam is particularly instructive. This is a fight that expands beyond Peter and Ernie into a conflict between human beings and chickens more broadly, a race war in the bar that has to be contained by the police. Ernie has allies. Ernie has a community. He is not a lone creature. He is embedded in a society of others like him, and he chose to escalate a personal feud into a collective conflict. This is a level of social organization and strategic planning that goes well beyond the coupon story. Ernie has been building something. What exactly he has been building, what the end goal of the seemingly endless conflict is, the show does not say. Section 9: Deaths, Resurrections, and the Rules of this Universe. A significant amount of philosophical confusion surrounds the question of what death means in the world of this show. The answer, based on available evidence, is that death means different things in different contexts, that the rules governing it are applied inconsistently and often retroactively, and that the one firm rule seems to be that named characters die when the show needs them to and return when the show needs them back. Death himself, as we have established, is a character. He appears in person. He is named. He has feelings. He can be talked into changing his decisions. He has been replaced at least once by a successor death after his own circumstances apparently changed. The presence of death as a social participant in the world means that mortality in this universe is managed rather than absolute. It is administered by an entity who can, under the right circumstances, be negotiated with. This is a fundamentally different metaphysical situation from the one most of us live with in the real world. Brian's death and resurrection in Season 12 is the most prominent example of the show engaging directly with the mechanics of mortality, and it left a set of questions that have been discussed ever since. The driver of the car that hit Brian was never identified. The timeline was altered by Stewie's intervention, so in the current canonical version of events, Brian was never hit. But this means that in the brief window between the moment Brian was struck and the moment Stewie went back to prevent it, a version of events existed where Brian was dead and the driver had escaped without consequence. Who was driving? The show's writers, when asked, have been vague. Seth MacFarlane, in interviews around the time of the episode's airing, focused on the emotional impact of Brian's death rather than the logistics of his resurrection. The question of the driver was left in the space between what happened and what was undone. One compelling theory suggests that the driver was a deliberate actor rather than an accident, that someone with knowledge of Stewie's time machine and a motive to prevent its continued use arranged the accident specifically at the moment when the machine had been destroyed. If true, the mystery of the driver becomes a mystery of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and chose a moment of maximum vulnerability to act. But there is an equally compelling argument that the driver was simply an accident, a drunk driver, or a reckless one, and that the show's decision not to identify them was a statement about the randomness of loss. Brian died the way real deaths happen, not with a villain and a motive and a narrative purpose, but because someone was not paying attention and a living being was in the wrong place. The lack of an answer is the answer. Some things do not have explanations that fit the shape of a story. The canon characters who have died and remained dead include Diane Simmons, who was shot by Stewie in the Season 9 premiere, and Muriel Goldman, who was also killed in that episode. The declaration of canon was important for the show at that point. and attempt to establish that not everything that happened could be undone by the next episode. The show had been drifting toward a universe of complete reversibility, where stakes were essentially non existent because any change could be reversed. And then there were fewer episodes tried to draw a line, but the line was drawn unevenly, as lines tend to be in a show with a floating timeline and a general preference for comedy over continuity. James Woods, who was also shot in that episode, was explained away with a celebrity lab. Other characters who have died in various episodes have returned in subsequent seasons through mechanisms ranging from the supernatural to the simply unexplained. The show occasionally seems to forget which deaths were declared canonical and which were not, and the audience has largely learned to hold these questions loosely. Stewie's near-death experiences across the show are numerous enough to constitute their own separate study. He has been in situations that should have ended him many times, and his survival in some of them requires the intervention of technology that he himself built, and that, in turn, required him to survive the current threat to build. The circular logic of Stewie's survival mirrors the circular logic of his birth. He is necessary. He survives because the timeline requires him to. The universe bends around Stewie Griffin the way space bends around mass, accommodating his presence because the alternative is incoherence. Peter Griffin's survival across various catastrophic situations is harder to explain in any clean way, because Peter does not have Stewie's technology or Stewie's cosmic significance. Peter has survived things that would have definitively ended a real person and returned from them with no apparent long-term effects. He has been shot, blown up, fallen from great heights, been in vehicle accidents, been in industrial accidents, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat with an effectively immortal giant chicken on a regular basis. His recovery from each of these events is almost always instantaneous, the comedy depending on the severity of the initial injury being forgotten before the next scene. This resilience is characteristic of animated characters generally, and Family Guy leans into it more heavily than most. But the show has occasionally pushed this far enough that the question becomes less about comedy and more about what kind of entity Peter Griffin actually is. He is large, yeah. He is, by the show's own occasional acknowledgement, abnormally durable. He has fought his way through situations that should have been the end and emerged battered but functional, ready for the next episode. Whether this is simply animated cartoon logic, or whether it suggests something about the specific nature of Peter Griffin's biology, the show leaves entirely unaddressed. The question of souls is raised obliquely in various episodes. In one episode, a story about Peter selling his soul to the devil eventually reveals that the soul in question was not actually Peter's, because Peter had, at some earlier point in the narrative, sold his soul to a record company. The show treats this as a comedy beat, but what it establishes is that souls in this universe are property that can be bought, sold, transferred, and contractually obligated. The ownership of a soul can lapse. The legal status of a soul can be unclear. This is theologically interesting in a show that is generally not interested in being theologically interesting, and it opens a set of questions about what exactly is at stake in the various supernatural situations the characters find themselves in. Section 10. Hidden references, Easter eggs, and background secrets. The writers of Family Guy have been hiding things in their show for over 25 years, and they are very good at it. Some of these hidden things are simple jokes intended for the most dedicated viewers, the ones who pause their screens and read every newspaper headline and catch every background sign. Others feel like something more deliberate, messages placed in plain sight where only the right kind of attention will find them. The newspaper headline Easter egg is one of the show's signature recurring devices. In a Season 5 episode, the Griffins appear in a newspaper photograph, and if you pause the image and read the smaller headlines below the main story, One of them reads in full DVDs paused. For headline joke, millions disappointed. This is a joke about the people pausing DVDs to read the headline. It is also, in a smaller way, a statement about the relationship between the show and its most engaged viewers. The show knows you are looking. It put something there for you to find. And then what it put there is a joke at your expense for looking. There is an affection in this, even in the teasing. The show and its most devoted viewers are in a relationship that has lasted decades, and this headline is the show's way of acknowledging that relationship while also maintaining its characteristic refusal to be caught being sincere. The TV Guide Easter egg is another of the show's most beloved background details. In an episode where Peter is searching for a story for Meg's school newspaper, he picks up a TV guide and the show is visible on the cover. If you look quickly or pause, you can read a small message beneath the cover image that says, "If you can read this, Family Guy is on the air." This was placed there during a period of the show's production history when its future was uncertain, when the specter of cancellation was real enough to feel. Someone on the writing staff put this message in a background detail as a small piece of defiance, a declaration that the show intended to keep existing. The Bender cameo is one of the show's most carefully hidden details, and also one of its most philosophically interesting. In the episode Blue Harvest, which is Family Guy's parody of the original Star Wars film, there is a bar scene in which Chris Griffin walks through a space cantina. If you look carefully at the background of the scene, you will see Bender from Futurama, the animated robot protagonist of another Fox animated series created during roughly the same era. Bender is not named. He is not acknowledged. He is simply there in the background, existing in the same fictional space as the Family Guy characters, without any character reacting to him. Too. The crossover implication is enormous. In a show where the multiverse is a canonical concept, in a show where alternate realities are accessible through technology a baby built, the presence of a character from another fictional universe in a background shot might not be an Easter egg at all. It might be continuity. The show has also placed versions of its writers and production staff into the background of episodes across the show's run. As background characters, as names on signs, as minor speaking roles with dialogue that is slightly too specific to be accidental. One recurrent, unnamed character who appears periodically as a background figure and has been dubbed Holden Caulfield by the show's production team and dedicated fans is an example of this kind of layered-in joke. He appears in an episode where Peter pretends to play keyboard, and this man, whose name is never given in the episode, spends the rest of the episode following Peter around and accusing him of being a phony. The reference to the Catcher in the Rye character is acknowledged by the production team's nickname for the character, even though the show never makes the reference explicit. The Robot Chicken universe in the Multiverse episode is a particular treasure for fans of both shows. Robot Chicken is a stop-motion animated comedy created by Seth Green, who also voices Chris Griffin. The two shows exist in a creative space where they are aware of each other, and the brief visit to a universe animated in the Robot Chicken style includes the meta joke of Stewie asking, somewhat archly, how it feels to be on a major network for 30 seconds. The Robot Chicken universe characters respond with an impolite expression of their feelings on the matter. This is a crossover in the most elaborate possible sense, a show visiting an alternate universe where another show is real. And the show being visited is itself aware that it is being visited by its neighbor. The show has hidden production in-jokes across virtually every season. Ron Jones and Walter Murphy, the composers who worked on the show's music at various points, appear in the background of a scene in the episode Brian Doe's Hollywood, in which they are listed alongside John Williams as nominees for Best Original Score in an Adult Film at an awards ceremony. The joke works on one level as an absurdist comedy bit, but it also functions as a tribute from the show to the people who have scored it, embedding their names in the show's mythology as a small piece of gratitude. The Wilhelm scream, the famous stock audio sample of a man screaming that has been used in Hollywood productions since the 1950s, and that appears in a vast number of films as an in-joke among sound designers, has been placed in multiple Family Guy episodes in various action sequences. Its appearances are not announced. They sit in the audio track waiting to be recognized by the people who know what they are listening for. The show's parodies of its own format have produced some of the most self-aware moments in its history, including an episode called Back to the Pilot, in which Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the show's very first episode. In this episode, the characters observe themselves in the original pilot and notice, among other things, the difference in animation style between then and now. The rougher, more handmade quality of the first season animation versus the cleaner lines of the later seasons is addressed directly. The show acknowledges its own visual history in a way that most long-running animated series would not bother with. The meta-commentary extends to the structure of the episode itself, with Brian and Stewie watching events that viewers with long memories will recognize, events that have been seen before and are now being seen again from a different angle. There is also the recurring detail of the house paintings, which we mentioned in the opening section, but which deserve a more complete treatment. The two mountain paintings that hang behind the couch in the Griffin living room are visible in virtually every episode that includes the living room. For 17 seasons, they were background details without context. Set dressing of the kind that animation crews include to fill a space without expecting anyone to look closely. And then, in season 18, Stewie names the mountain Mount Quahog. Someone kept those paintings there for 17 years, waiting for the moment when the geography of the fictional world would be established enough to give them meaning. This is either one of the most patient Easter eggs in television history, or a happy coincidence that a writer decided to make retroactively meaningful. Either way, the result is the same. Something that was always there suddenly means something. The background of the living room, a place you have seen hundreds of times, is slightly richer now than it was before you knew the name. Section 11. The Multiverse, Crossovers, and What Lies Between Shows. Stewie Griffin built a device that allows travel between parallel universes. This is canon. The device works. The multiverse is real in the world of this show. Brian and Stewie have used various versions of this device across multiple episodes to visit realities that range from mildly different to completely unrecognizable. And the implications of a functional multiverse device in the hands of two characters who use it, with the casualness most people use GPS are, when you sit with them, rather remarkable. The Season 8 premiere, Road to the Multiverse, takes Brian and Stewie through a series of alternate realities with sufficient velocity that the episode feels like a guided tour of what the show could have been rather than what it is. They visit a universe where Christianity never developed, meaning the dark ages of scientific suppression never happened, and humanity is 1,000 years more technologically advanced than it currently is. They visit a universe where everything is animated in the Disney style of the 1930s through 1950s. A universe where the show's characters become graceful, singing creatures with enormous innocent eyes, and where the arrival of Mort Goldman is greeted with mob hostility by this saccharine universe's inhabitants, in a joke about Walt Disney's personal history that the show handles with its characteristic lack of squeamishness about historical discomfort. They visit a universe where Japan won the Pacific War, where the United States was occupied, where the show's characters speak Japanese and wear historical dress. They visit a universe where Frank Sinatra was never born and therefore never used his influence to get John F. Kennedy elected, and therefore Richard Nixon won the 1960 election and badly mismanaged the Cuban Missile Crisis, and therefore World War III happened, and therefore the town is a wasteland. The Frank Sinatra counterfactual is the kind of alternate history that actual historians find interesting. The point of divergence that seems minor and turns out to be everything. It also functions as a tribute to Sinatra's cultural power, making the argument that one entertainer's existence was sufficient to prevent the end of the world. They visit a universe where dogs are the dominant species and humans are their pets. Brian, who is a dog who lives with humans and has occasionally been treated as a pet rather than a person in his primary universe, reacts to this with a kind of homecoming that is genuinely touching. He does not want to leave. He has found a world where his nature is affirmed rather than complicated, and the show understands this well enough to let him feel it fully before the plot requires his departure. They visit a universe that is live action, where the town and its inhabitants exist in the real world rather than animation. And this universe is presented without fanfare or elaborate joke, simply as one more option among many. The live action universe is funny specifically because it refuses to be special. It is just another stop on the tour, one more contingency in an infinite set of contingencies. The multiverse device was shown, in the episode where Brian died, to be accessible from alternate versions of itself. When Stewie needed to borrow a return pad to go back and save Brian, he found a version of himself from a near future moment who had just come back from buying Christmas toys early. He borrowed that Stewie's return pad. This means that the timelines created by using the multiverse device are themselves accessible to the device, that the device can reach across the variants it creates, and that the topology of the accessible multiverse is substantially more complex than a simple lateral move between parallel realities. You can borrow from your own future. You can intersect with variants of yourself. The geometry of this is not Euclidean. The crossover with The Simpsons, which aired in a season 13 episode called The Simpsons Guy, represents the largest single fictional collision the show has ever been involved in, and it handles this collision with both respect and rivalry. The Griffins end up in Springfield through a mechanism too convoluted to fully summarize. And what follows is an episode-long negotiation between two shows that have coexisted in animated television for decades, with an awareness of each other that has never been particularly comfortable. The fight between Peter and Homer, which mirrors the structure of Peter's chicken fights, is the episode's centerpiece. And the fact that Homer throws Emmy Awards at Peter, who is unable to retaliate because he has none, is a piece of genuine creative honesty from the Family Guy side of the equation. An acknowledgement that The Simpsons has an awards history that Family Guy does not. The episode also includes Roger from American Dad briefly appearing and then immediately leaving, which functions as a visual representation of that show's relationship to the Fox animation universe, present but on its own terms. American Dad, created by Seth MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, represents an interesting case study in what the same creative universe can look like when its internal logic is handled differently. Stan Smith and his family exist in a world that shares many surface characteristics with the world of Spooner Street, but operates on fundamentally different storytelling principles. No cutaway gags. Consistent character development. A house that includes a CIA operative, an alien who lives in the attic, and a goldfish who is actually a man's brain in a fish's body, and which somehow manages to feel more emotionally coherent than the Griffin household despite these elements. Roger the alien, in particular, represents a character concept that seems designed to correct something that Stewie's later development left unfilled. Roger can be anyone. He adopts complete alternate identities, different names, different personalities, different physical presentations, and each of these personas is treated as fully real within the episode that features it. This is a character whose nature is defined by infinite variation rather than a fixed identity, and it creates exactly the kind of storytelling latitude that the original evil Stewie concept also contained, but which was eventually narrowed rather than expanded. Roger was given the room that Stewie ran out of. The suggestion that the worlds of Family Guy and American Dad exist in the same larger fictional universe has been reinforced by various crossover moments and references across the two shows. Stan Smith and his family exist somewhere in the same America that contains Spooner Street. Their universes overlap at the edges, the way the territories of two radio stations sometimes overlap at the margins of their broadcast range, producing a static that is, if you pay attention to it, its own kind of signal. Section 12. The unanswered questions that keep us up at night. We come now to the questions that the show has left sitting in the open air. The ones that began in one episode and were never finished. The ones that the writers planted and then walked away from. The ones that feel less like oversights and more like deliberate invitations to wonder. These are the questions that belong to the part of you that watches a long-running show and builds a relationship with its world. The part that notices things and keeps them. The first and most persistent is the question of Stewie's intelligence. Not whether he is intelligent, that is not in question. The question is what explains it. Every other member of the Griffin family has an intelligence level that maps roughly onto what their age and background would suggest. Peter is not bright, Lois is competent and perceptive, but not exceptional. Chris and Meg are teenagers with the cognitive range that implies. And then there is Stewie, who is 1 year old and who can build a time machine. The show treats this as a given, a premise it establishes in the pilot and never interrogates. But the disparity between Stewie's intelligence and everyone else's in the family is so extreme that it demands some explanation, and the show has never provided one. Is it genetic? Is it the result of something that happened in utero? Is there something specific about Stewie's biology, perhaps related to the genetic loop of his own ancestry, that accounts for what he is? The show does not say Stewie is simply this way. The question of who is actually in Stewie's body, as established by the yellow eyes ending of the hand that rocks the wheelchair, is one that the show has never definitively resolved. The show's behavior in subsequent episodes is consistent with the survival of the original Stewie, but the ambiguity was placed there deliberately, and until the show explicitly addresses it, the doubt remains. Is the Stewie who's been best friends with Brian since season 9 the original Stewie? Or is he the clone? Does it matter? The show says probably not, but the show also said, look at these yellow eyes. Make of them what you will. The question of Brian's novel, which has appeared in various forms across the show's run as a marker of Brian's artistic aspirations, is one that the show has used in contradictory ways. At various points, the novel is described as nearly finished, as completely lost, as published, and terrible, as a source of ongoing frustration. The specific content of the novel has never been pinned down with any precision. It is, in the show's use of it, less a specific creative work and more a symbol for everything Brian has been reaching toward that he cannot quite grasp. But it exists in canon. Someone, somewhere in the show's world, has a manuscript or a collection of notes or an electronic document that represents Brian Griffin's attempt to put something true about the world into language. What is in that document? The question of the precise mechanism by which Brian became capable of human speech, human behavior, and human-level cognition, while the other dogs in the show are shown to be non-speaking animals, is one the show has flagged occasionally but never answered. Brian's parents were regular dogs. The show has told us this. His mother was sold away when he was a puppy, a sad story told in a flashback with unusual warmth. His mother did not speak. His mother did not drive. His mother did not have opinions about wine or literature or the state of contemporary American letters. Brian's parents were dogs, and Brian is not, and the show has never explained how the transition happened. The question of Peter Griffin's physical capabilities, specifically his resilience to damage that would be fatal to any real person, is one that the show has occasionally used as a meta joke, but never as a genuine plot point. Peter has survived things that are survivable only in cartoons, and the show knows it is a cartoon, and it has made jokes about knowing it is a cartoon. But the level of resilience Peter demonstrates sometimes exceeds even the liberal physics of animated comedy and starts to feel like something specific to Peter Griffin as an entity. He is not merely a cartoon character. He is a cartoon character who, even by cartoon standards, seems unusually difficult to remove from the world. The question of what Cleveland Brown's 4 years in Stoolbent meant for his relationship with the show's other characters, what he learned there, how he changed, is one the show largely bypassed by having him return and resume his previous role as though the spin-off had been a vacation rather than a life. In those 4 years, Cleveland had a full second existence. He remarried, he had a blended family, he built a new community, he experienced things that should have left marks. When he came back, the marks were invisible, absorbed by the floating timeline's ability to treat absence as insignificance. The question of what exactly the Griffin house looked like before the Griffins lived in it, what its history is, who built it, whether the panic room was there when they moved in or was added after, is one the show has never directly addressed, but has gestured toward in ways that imply a depth of history behind that particular property. The house predates the Griffins, predates the all houses predate their current occupants. This one may have a longer history than the show has ever chosen to share. The question of Brian's gun in the safety deposit box is the one that sits with me longest. It is there. In the world of the show, it is there. In a vault somewhere, loaded, belonging to a character who confessed to his best friend that he has thought about using it on himself. The show said this out loud in what is considered one of its finest episodes, and then moved on. The gun did not become a story. It became a fact. And facts, unlike stories, do not have endings. They simply persist. This is the nature of a world built over 25 years on a floating timeline in a fictional Rhode Island town where God lights farts, and babies build time machines, and a man has been fighting a chicken over an expired coupon since the turn of the millennium. It does not resolve. It accumulates. Every episode adds to the pile, and the pile never diminishes. And the pile is not a problem, but an invitation. An invitation to sit with these people, to let the logic of their world wash over you in the gentle way that well-told stories wash over you when you are horizontal and comfortable and the night is quiet. You know these characters now. You know the things they carry. You know the things they have left behind in the corners of 25-plus seasons of television that nobody came back to retrieve. You know that the mountain paintings behind the couch have a name now, and that the name was always there waiting. You know that somewhere in a Rhode Island bank vault, a white dog left something that tells a truth. The rest of the show spends most of its runtime avoiding. You know that a baby who built the universe has never had to explain himself. You know that a street in a fictional town is full of houses where the lights are on and the televisions are murmuring, and something is always, quietly, happening. Let the knowledge sit softly. Let the questions drift. Let Spooner Street settle around you the way a neighborhood settles at the end of the night, when the last porch light goes off and the last car pulls into the last driveway, and the hum of something far away is the only sound left. You do not need to solve any of this tonight. You just need to sleep. If you made it this far, genuinely thank you. This is the channel. This is what we do. If you want to see more of this, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell because more is coming. Every mystery, every character, every world we love, enough to go deep into, it all lives here. We will see you in the next one. Uncle Guy lore. Fall asleep to every mystery. In Family Guy script, full-length section 13. The mythology of the drunken clam. A neighborhood in amber. There is a specific quality of light that belongs to a bar on a Tuesday night when the regulars have settled into their seats and the conversation has found its rhythm. The kind of light that is not quite warm and not quite cold, that falls across the table in a way that makes whatever is being said feel slightly more significant than it might elsewhere. This is the quality of light inside the drunken clam, at least as the show has always presented it. A place where the texture of daily life gets temporarily suspended and replaced by a different kind of reality. Peter Griffin, Joe Swanson, Cleveland Brown, and Glenn Quagmire have been meeting at this bar since the show's first season. And their conversations across all those years, if you laid them end to end, would constitute an oral history of a particular kind of American male friendship in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The friendship that forms in early adulthood and proves more durable than anyone expected. The friendship that persists through marriages, children, jobs crises, and the accumulated weight of years in a way that the friendships of youth rarely do. What makes the Drunken Clam significant as a setting is not just that it is where these four men spend their social time. It is that the bar functions as a kind of civic center for the show's world. A place where information passes between characters, where relationships are negotiated, where the news of the neighborhood gets processed through the filter of people who have known each other long enough to hear what is underneath the words being said. Horace's ownership of the bar is something the show established from the beginning and kept consistent for many seasons. An unusual commitment to continuity for a show that is generally relaxed about these things. Horace was a background character who was always there behind the counter, serving drinks without much commentary, existing as the constant human element of a place that the main characters treated as an extension of their homes. When Horace died, the show gave it weight. The guys were not just losing their bar, they were losing the person who had been part of the fabric of their lives for as long as the show had existed. The effort to save the bar from foreclosure after Horace's death is one of the show's more grounded later storylines, precisely because the stakes are personal rather than cosmic. Nobody is traveling through time. Nobody is building a device. The problem is that a place these men love is going to disappear unless they do something. And the something they are capable of doing is limited and human. This is the show at its most recognizably domestic. And it is often in these domestic moments that the character dynamics reveal themselves most clearly. Cleveland's absence during a significant portion of the middle of the show's run changed the dynamic at the Clam in ways that were never fully addressed. A group that had been four became three, and the shape of three is different from the shape of four. Jerome was introduced as a replacement, the show acknowledging the vacancy with characteristic directness. But Jerome occupied a structural role without the history that makes a group of friends feel inevitable. He was new. He was a good person. He was not Cleveland. The Jerome era at the bar is one of the show's longest experiments in replacement dynamics. And what it reveals is that the specific chemistry of the original four was not reproducible. You can fill a chair, but you cannot fill the person who used to sit in it. The bar's history of being destroyed and rebuilt parallels something about the nature of the show itself. Things get broken. They come back. The structure that houses the friendship persists even when the physical building does not. After fires, after flooding, after the events of Daboom in which the world more or less ended and Peter found that the bar was still there in the aftermath of nuclear catastrophe, the Drunken Clam endured. Its endurance is not realistic by any meaningful standard, but it is consistent with the show's understanding of what the bar represents. It is not a building, it is a relationship. And relationships, even when they are battered and charred around the edges, have a resilience that buildings lack. The show has also used the bar as a setting for some of its most dramatically concentrated moments. The scenes where characters say things to each other that are more honest than what gets said at home or at work. There is a quality to bar conversations, a lowering of certain defenses in exchange for a slight softening of the world's edges that allows people to say things they would otherwise leave unsaid. The guys at the Clam have said things to each other over the years that did not get said anywhere else. Joe has talked about his disability with a frankness he does not bring to other settings. Cleveland has been more emotionally available at that bar than almost anywhere else in the show's world. Quagmire has, in the bar's context, occasionally revealed something approaching genuine self-awareness about the gap between who he is and who he wants to be. These moments are scattered across the show's long run, and they do not accumulate in the way that moments in a more serialized drama would. But they exist and they form a kind of shadow history of the friendship, the version of these four men that only the bar has seen. Section 14. The Evil Monkey and the Griffin House's Deeper Strangeness. For several seasons of Family Guy, there was an evil monkey living in Chris Griffin's closet. This is a fact of the show's world that was deployed as a recurring visual gag, the payoff being the moment in which Chris's fearful references to the evil monkey in his closet were proven correct by the appearance of a scowling, pointing primate whenever someone opened that door. The monkey existed. It was real, in universe. It was living in the closet of a teenage boy in a house in Rhode Island, and nobody in the family, with the exception of Chris, seemed particularly motivated to address this. The evil monkey's backstory was eventually revealed in a season 9 episode that functioned as its official farewell. The monkey, it turned out, had a name, though the show never used it. He had been living in the closet since his wife left him, a devastating romantic loss that had soured him on the world and caused him to take up residence in a suburban Rhode Island teenager's wardrobe. His menacing demeanor was not predatory, it was grief. He pointed his finger at Chris and scowled because he was a heartbroken primate who had found a dark enclosed space to sit in his feelings, and the dark enclosed space happened to belong to someone else. This reveal is one of the show's more genuinely surprising tonal shifts, taking a years-long running gag rooted in horror imagery and revealing that its source is not malice but sadness. The evil monkey is not evil. He is a divorcee who has made some questionable choices about where to process his emotions. The episode ends with the monkey leaving the closet after what the show presents as a resolution of his grief arc, and he departs to begin a new chapter somewhere else in the show's world. He has appeared in subsequent episodes, no longer specifically in Chris's closet, no longer specifically hostile. But think about the years leading up to this resolution. For roughly the first decade of the show's run, there was a grieving monkey in a child's closet. He was there during homework sessions and bad dreams and the ordinary daily texture of an adolescent's bedroom life. Every night when Chris turned out his light, the monkey was 3 feet away in the dark. The horror comedy of this setup was entirely dependent on treating the monkey as a threat rather than as a sufferer, and the show committed to that framing for years before shifting the perspective. The house at 31 Spooner Street has had other unusual guests and residents over the years that collectively suggest the building is more porous to the strange than a typical suburban home should be. There was a period when a ghost lived there, which Peter eventually had to negotiate with through means that the show found funnier than disturbing. There have been episodes involving the house being cursed, being transported to other locations, being invaded by various parties for various reasons. and being the site of events that would, in any realistic context, prompt the family to consider relocating. They never relocate. This is interesting. The Griffins have had experiences in and around that house that most families would have used as sufficient reason to leave, and they have stayed. This could be read as a statement about what Peter and Lois prioritize. It could be read as a statement about economics, that the house, whatever its history, is what they can afford, and the alternative to staying is something worse than the inconveniences of remaining. Or it could be read as the show saying something about the nature of home more broadly, that the place you live accumulates not just good memories, but difficult ones, and that the difficulty does not make it less home, it makes it more. The attic, the basement, the individual rooms of the house all have histories that surface occasionally across the show's long run. Stewie's room is the most technically interesting space in the house, containing as it does the inventory of gadgets and weapons we have already discussed, as well as Rupert, the stuffed bear who functions as Stewie's primary emotional outlet for a significant portion of the show's middle seasons. Rupert's status as a confidant, a confessor, a witness to Stewie's moods and plans in occasional crises is played for comedy. But the relationship between a brilliant, lonely child and a stuffed animal is not fundamentally different from the relationship between any child and a beloved object that serves as a stand-in for safe attachment. Rupert cannot talk back. Rupert cannot judge. Rupert is always there. The episode in which Brian destroys Rupert, chewing the bear apart while drunk because he had grown tired of Stewie's attachment to it, is considered by many fans to be one of the clearest examples of the character decline that Brian underwent in the later seasons. It is a hard scene to watch, not because of what is destroyed, which is a stuffed bear, but because of what the destruction says about the person doing it. Brian found the thing that mattered most to Stewie, and he took it apart because he could, because he was angry and drunk, and the target of his anger was not present, and Rupert was. Stewie's response to this destruction was rage, but it was a different kind of rage from his matricidal fury of the early seasons. It was the rage of someone who has been hurt in a small and specific place, the loss of something private and irreplaceable rather than the frustration of grand plans being blocked. The Stewie who grieved for Rupert was a Stewie who had developed the capacity for that specific kind of grief, the quiet kind that does not announce itself as important, but that sits in you long after the immediate event has passed. Section 15. The show's relationship with its own history. One of the most interesting things about Family Guy as a creative artifact is the degree to which the show has always been in conversation with itself, aware of its own history, occasionally willing to hold that history up to the light and turn it around. This self-awareness operates at multiple levels simultaneously. There are the obvious meta jokes, the fourth wall breaks, the moments where characters refer to being on a television show. But there's a deeper level of self-awareness that operates through the show's willingness to contradict itself, to revisit its own premises, to acknowledge the passage of time even within a timeline that technically refuses to acknowledge the passage of time. The season 10 episode Back to the Pilot is the most explicitly self-referential episode in the show's history, and it works because the show has had a long enough run that revisiting its own first episode creates genuine emotional resonance. Brian and Stewie traveling back to the events of the pilot are not visiting a fictional past. They are visiting a past that the audience actually lived through, a collective memory of a show that many viewers have watched from the beginning. The rougher animation, the different characterizations, the slightly different tone of the earliest episodes, these things are visible and felt by anyone who has watched the show from its origins, and the episode uses that visibility as its subject. The changes between the pilot and the season 10 episode are themselves a form of information. The show has gotten slicker and in some ways colder. The characters have changed in ways that the show's meta commentary tends to acknowledge obliquely, making jokes about quality while declining to address the specifics of what changed and why. But the willingness to stand next to its own beginning, to let the audience compare and draw conclusions, is itself a kind of honesty. The show has also, across various episodes, played with the question of what it means for characters who do not age to exist in a world that does age. The floating timeline that keeps the Griffin children perpetually the same ages while technology around them advances is acknowledged in various ways, sometimes as a joke, sometimes as a piece of world building that the show accepts as a feature of its reality. The children do not age, but they use smartphones. The culture around them advances through time while they remain fixed. This creates a particular kind of character, one who is perpetually situated in the present without ever having been formed by the past the way real children are formed. Stewie is always 1 year old. He is always 1 year old in the current year, whatever that year happens to be. He is eternal in his infancy, cosmically significant, and perpetually in a diaper. The show's treatment of its own cancellation history is another piece of this self-awareness. Having been canceled twice and revived twice, Family Guy has a relationship with its own near death that most television shows do not develop. The Adult Swim revival, the DVD sales, the fan campaigns, these things are part of the show's mythology in a way that is unusual. The show knows it almost did not make it back. It knows its audience made it make it back. This knowledge shapes the show's relationship with its audience in ways that occasionally surface as something more meaningful than a standard performer-audience dynamic. The finale of the fifth season, untitled Griffin Family History, which served as the season finale before it was known that a sixth season had been ordered, has the quality of a show writing its own obituary. The frame story of the Griffins trapped in a panic room, while family history is narrated, has the atmosphere of a gathering of things that matter before the potential end. Whether this quality was intentional or whether it is something we read into it in retrospect, knowing the show's precarious relationship with continuation at that point is one of the questions you cannot fully answer. But the episode feels like a holding of things, a preservation of what this world contains, in case the world does not get to continue. It did continue. It has continued for over 20 years beyond that moment. But the tendency to hold things, to narrate the family history before the lights might go out, is a quality that runs through the show's best moments. The sense that these characters and their world are worth the effort of remembering, worth the effort of examining closely, worth the effort of sitting with in the quiet. Section 16. What the show knows about itself that it never says out loud. There is a category of knowledge in Family Guy that exists beneath the comedy, beneath the cutaways, beneath the meta jokes about the show's own quality and longevity. It is the knowledge that the show has built into its characters through 2+ decades of storytelling. The understanding it has accumulated about who these people are and what they are carrying, that it never quite assembles into a coherent statement. The show knows things about its characters that it does not tell you. It shows you in fragments across hundreds of episodes and trusts that you will put the fragments together. It knows that Peter Griffin is a man who was never fully accepted by his family of origin and has spent his adult life unconsciously recreating the conditions of that rejection in his own household. It knows that his loudness and his absurdity and his relentless pursuit of the next adventure are a man running from something quiet and painful at his center. It knows that he loves his family in a way that is genuine even when his behavior is not. That the love and the damage coexist in him the way they coexist in most people who are not loved. Well enough when they needed it. It knows that Lois Griffin chose Peter because she was running from something too, from the cold efficiency of the Pewterschmidt world, from a father whose wealth could not make him warm, from the expectation that she would make a comfortable and strategic marriage rather than one that made her feel something. It knows that she sometimes regrets the specific texture of what her life became without regretting the choice that led to it. It knows she is more capable than her circumstances allow her to fully express, and that this gap between capability and expression is a source of a quiet frustration that the show occasionally surfaces and then submerges. It knows that Brian Griffin is, at his core, trying to be seen. The novel, the politics, the intellectual posturing, the relationships, all of it is the behavior of a creature who grew up fundamentally unseen, who watched the car carrying the one person who recognized him drive away down a road, and who has been trying ever since to become someone whose significance is undeniable. The tragedy of Brian in the later seasons is not that he became insufferable, though he did. It is that the insufferability is the grief taking a shape that pushes people away. He wants to matter. His wanting is too loud. The loudness pushes away the very people whose recognition would quiet it. It knows that Stewie Griffin is, underneath the genius and the time travel and the cosmic significance, a child who wants his mother to see him. Not to be killed by him, to see him. The matricidal plots of the early seasons are the most extreme possible expression of a desire to be noticed by the person who is supposed to notice you most. Lois looks at Stewie and sees a baby. Stewie looks at Lois and sees the person standing between him and the world, taking him seriously. The elaborate plans, the weaponry, the world domination schemes. These are a baby's way of demanding the attention that should have been freely given. This reading is complicated by the warmth that develops between Stewie and Lois in the middle and later seasons, as the villainous version of Stewie gives way to the more vulnerable one. The show eventually has Stewie love his mother in a way that is expressed rather than suppressed. He acts to save her. He grieves when she is in danger. The arc from kill your mother to protect your mother covers the entire span of the show's most significant character development, and it covers it so gradually that you can miss it if you are watching episode by episode rather than decade by decade. It knows that Meg Griffin is the most functional member of her household in the sense that matters most, which is that she understands her own situation with a clarity nobody else in the family possesses. She knows what she is. She knows what role she plays. She has chosen, not been broken into choosing, but chosen to continue playing it because the alternative involves a dissolution that would harm people she loves despite everything. This is not resignation. This is a decision made with open eyes by someone who knows the full cost of the alternatives. The show never quite gives Meg the credit this clarity deserves, but the credit is there for anyone who watches the Hurricane episode and takes what it is actually saying seriously. It knows that Joe Swanson's bravery is not the bravery that gets announced. The bravery of getting into the wheelchair each morning and going out and doing the job and being the person his family and his friends need him to be, not despite the injury, but in full acknowledgement of it. This is the kind of heroism that does not get speeches. It gets Tuesday mornings. It gets the bar on Thursday nights. It gets the neighbor who is always there when something needs doing, who never waits to be asked because he already knows what needs doing and he has already decided he's going to do it. It knows that the friendship between these four men, the one that gets built in the bar and maintained on the street and expressed in the sometimes terrible ways that men of a certain generation express care, is one of the more honestly portrayed elements of the show. These are not perfect friends. They are frequently terrible friends by any objective standard. But they are present. They show up. They have shown up for years across marriages and divorces and deaths and disasters and the ordinary accumulation of a life. The presence is the thing, not the correctness, not the articulation, the presence. It knows that the town this all takes place in, the fictional Rhode Island city, with its invalid zip code and its unregistered addresses, and its mayor who played himself, and its school named after a character who committed crimes within its own episodes, is not really a place. It is a projection. It is what you get when someone misses something about the world and tries to recreate it in a form that can be visited repeatedly. Family Guy is Seth MacFarlane's childhood, processed and distorted and sometimes weaponized, played out by characters who are too exaggerated to be real, but too specific to be abstractions. The things that make the show great and the things that make it sometimes difficult to watch are inseparable from each other. The heart and the cruelty come from the same place. The love that the characters occasionally express and the damage they regularly inflict on each other are both true at the same time. The way they are true in most families, most friendships, most long relationships of any kind. You cannot have the warmth without the difficulty. The difficulty is what makes the warmth feel earned. This is the secret that Family Guy has been keeping in plain sight for over 25 years. Not a plot secret. Not a mystery about a character or a location or a narrative thread. The secret is that the show is not primarily about the jokes. The jokes are the delivery system. The show is about what it feels like to be in a family that does not always know how to love you well and to love them back anyway, and to find the people who become family even when they are not blood. And to sit with those people in the particular quality of light that belongs to a Tuesday night at the end of a long week, and to let what cannot be said exist in the space between what is said. This is 31 Spooner Street. This is a bar called The Drunken Clam. This is a fictional town that cannot receive mail. This is where the porch lights are still on, even now, late as it is. You have been here long enough to know it. You are allowed to rest in it. The show will be here tomorrow. The mysteries will still be there. The questions will still have the same shape. But none of them need answers tonight. Tonight, you just need to let the light go out, the way lights always eventually go out on Spooner Street, and drift towards something softer. Good night. Whatever corner of the world you are in right now, however late it is, however far you traveled to get here, this was time well spent. The mysteries keep. The questions keep. The show keeps. And you have what you came for. If you found this video, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Hit subscribe if you want more deep dives just like this one, into the shows and worlds and characters that deserve to be examined closely, slowly with the attention they earned. We have more coming. We will see you in the next one. Uncle Guy lore. Fall asleep to every mystery in Family Guy. Full extended script. Section 17. Every death in the show and what it tells us. Death, in a show that features the personification of death as a recurring social character, is handled with the peculiar logic of a universe that understands mortality intellectually, but is not entirely committed to its permanence. The Grim Reaper in this world shows up at parties, gets talked out of taking people, has car accidents, and at one point needed to be temporarily replaced by a successor because circumstances required it. The administrative structure of mortality in the show is handled by a being who is himself subject to the social pressures and situational negotiations that mortality is supposed to be immune to. And yet some deaths in this show are genuinely permanent. Some characters leave and do not come back. The distinction between the deaths that stick and the deaths that do not is not always obvious in advance, and the show has never codified the rules in a way that allows a viewer to predict which category a given death will fall into. Diane Simmons died. Muriel Goldman died. These deaths were declared canonical by the show's creator in the aftermath of the Season 9 premiere, and they have largely been honored in subsequent episodes. The canonicity declaration was an unusual move for a show that rarely makes explicit statements about what is and is not permanent within its world. And the fact that it was made at all suggests that the show understood it had a credibility problem. After years of resetting everything to the status quo, the promise that some things would stay changed needed to be made explicitly because the implicit assumption had become that nothing stayed changed. But the deaths that are not declared canonical raise their own questions. Countless background characters have died in the show's various action sequences and the disaster scenarios, deaths that are played for comedy and never acknowledged in subsequent episodes. The chicken fights alone have generated a body count that, if the show ever bothered to acknowledge it, would have significant implications for the legal and social position of both Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken. Buildings have collapsed, vehicles have crashed, crowds have been caught in the crossfire of conflicts that were primarily between two people but that affected everyone in the vicinity. The show operates with a kind of narrative triage when it comes to death. Named characters get funerals, or at least acknowledgement, while background characters cease to exist when the scene ends. This is entirely standard for the genre, and nobody should be surprised by it. But in a show that has occasionally taken death seriously enough to declare certain deaths canonical and to handle the grief of surviving characters with genuine emotional weight, the contrast between meaningful and meaningless deaths is starker than it might be in a show that never engaged with mortality seriously at all. The question of what happens after death in this universe is complicated by the show's literal portrayal of the afterlife in various episodes. Heaven is real in this world. Hell is real. God is real and has been met by the characters. Death is real and has been negotiated with. The metaphysics of the show's universe include a genuine afterlife that is accessible and has been visited by at least one of the main characters in various episodes. This means that when a character dies in this show, they do not simply cease to exist. They go somewhere. The somewhere is a known location with known characteristics, managed by known entities. This is an unusually rich metaphysical environment for a primetime animated comedy, and the show has handled it with a characteristic blend of specificity and casualness. God exists. Heaven exists. These things are true. They are also funny. The humor does not diminish the reality of these elements within the show's world. They are both genuinely present and genuinely absurd, which is, perhaps, the most honest thing a show can say about its understanding of the universe. Section 18. The show's strangest episodes and what they reveal. Every long-running television show develops, over time, a set of episodes that do not fit cleanly into the show's usual mode of operation. They are stranger than the average episode. They take the show's premise in directions that feel experimental rather than routine. They are often among the most discussed and most analyzed episodes in retrospect, because they reveal something about what the show could do when it was willing to work outside its comfort zone. Family Guy has accumulated a significant collection of these episodes across its long run, and they form an interesting catalog of what the show was willing to try when it pushed past its usual formulas. Brian and Stewie, the Season 8 episode in which the two of them are locked in a bank vault, is the most extreme departure from the show's normal register. No other characters, no cutaways, no random gags. Just a talking dog and a baby genius sitting in an enclosed space for the better part of a standard episode, having the kind of honest conversation that the show usually deflects with a joke. Brian's revelation about the gun, Stewie's confession of how much Brian means to him, the raw emotional work of two characters who spend most of their screen time performing wit at each other, suddenly stripped of the performance and left with the thing underneath it. This episode is cited regularly as evidence that the show could have been something richer than it usually was, that the talent was always there for a different kind of story. The episode proves the argument. It also sits alone, not the beginning of a new direction, but a single extraordinary deviation, which is its own kind of revelation. The road trip episodes, the series that began with Road to Rhode Island in season 2 and continued through various installments, including Road to Germany, Road to the North Pole, Road to the Multiverse, and Road to Vegas, represent a separate strain of experimental storytelling that the show developed for Brian and Stewie's relationship specifically. These episodes are inspired explicitly by the road to films of Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, a series of musical comedies from the 1940s that were defined by breezy camaraderie and the chemistry between their two leads. The choice of this template is interesting because the Hope Crosby films were vehicles for a particular kind of male friendship, easy and affectionate, and built on a mutual delight in each other's company that never had to be stated explicitly because it was visible in every scene. Brian and Stewie in the road trip episodes are given the space to be with each other in a way that the show's regular format does not always accommodate. The adventures they have are the context. The relationship is the subject. These episodes also tend to be the ones where the show is most willing to take its comedy in unexpected directions, including the extraordinary darkness of Road to the North Pole, in which Brian and Stewie's attempt to find Santa Claus leads them to a version of Christmas that is far more bleak and morally complicated than the premise would suggest. In that episode, Christmas has been commercialized to such a degree that Santa's operation is grotesquely overextended. The elves are in terrible condition. The reindeer are dying. The entire North Pole infrastructure is collapsing under the weight of expectations that have grown beyond any reasonable capacity to meet. Brian and Stewie end up killing several reindeer in the process of trying to complete Santa's deliveries, and the experience leaves them both shaken in a way that is not resolved by the episode's ending. It is a holiday special that takes its premise seriously enough to find real darkness in it, and the darkness is not played for shock, but for meaning. The episode is saying something about consumerism, about expectation, about the price that is paid behind the scenes for the abundance that sits in front of us. It says it with dead reindeer and an exhausted Santa, and two characters who are trying to do a good thing and discovering that good intentions in a broken system produce damage rather than repair. The Stewie Kills. Lois and Lois Kills Stewie two-parter is the show's most ambitious piece of mythology work, and it functions as both a climax and a conclusion for the original version of Stewie's character. Everything the first 5 seasons built toward comes to fruition in those episodes. Stewie finally does what he has been planning to do for the entire series. The world changes, and then the world unchanges. The reset button is pressed, and the original version of Stewie is effectively retired in the moment that his defining ambition is acknowledged and then undone. The choice to frame this as a simulation, as something that happened in Stewie's computer, rather than in the show's primary reality, is the kind of narrative decision that feels clever in the moment and slightly deflating in retrospect. The show got to have its most dramatic event and then immediately neutralize its consequences. It got the spectacle without the weight. This is a creative choice that the show made repeatedly across its run in various forms. The tendency to escalate and then retreat, to gesture toward consequence and then pull the gesture back before it had to be honored. The two-parter is the most visible version of this pattern, but it is far from the only one. An untitled Griffin Family History, the season 5 episode, is underrated as a piece of experimental television. The decision to structure an entire episode as a nested set of historical parody sketches connected by the thin premise of a family trapped in a panic room produces something that is more thematically unified than it appears. Each historical sketch is not random. Each one reflects something about the Griffin family's specific character. Their tendency toward both heroism and disaster, their persistence across impossible circumstances, the way the same traits that make them maddening also make them, in their own specific and chaotic way, hard to extinguish. Moses Griffin leads people to freedom badly. Nate Griffin survives captivity through ingenuity and a willingness to be unconventional. Each iteration of the Griffin pattern carries something forward through history that the current Griffin family members contain without fully knowing. The road not taken in Family Guy's experimental history is the Seahorse Seashell Party episode, which we discussed in the Meg section, but which deserves acknowledgement here as an experiment in a different register from most of the show's attempts. The hurricane episode takes the show's established family dynamics and puts them in a pressure cooker, stripping away the regular external distractions and forcing the family to exist with each other at full intensity. The result is the show's most honest examination of the damage it has done to one of its own characters, a moment where the accumulated weight of the show's choices toward Meg is assembled into a single confrontation and then, in the episode's devastating resolution, put back in place. The experiment of the Seahorse Seashell Party is the experiment of honesty. The show looked at what it had been doing for years and held it up to the light. The resolution where Meg chooses to return to her role is either the most depressing or the most complex ending the show ever wrote for her, depending on how you read it. Either interpretation leaves you with more questions than you had before the episode started. Section 19, the peripheral characters and the lives. The cameras miss. The world of Spooner Street and the fictional Rhode Island town extends well beyond the characters the show follows closely. There's a secondary layer of recurring figures whose lives we glimpse through windows and doorways, whose stories are suggested rather than told, who exist in the peripheral vision of the main narrative rather than at its center. Tom Tucker and his son Jake are one of the show's most interesting background relationships. Tom Tucker is the news anchor, the face of the local station, a man whose public persona and private life diverge in ways so the show occasionally exploits for comedy. His son, Jake, has been portrayed as a conventionally unattractive child. The visual punchline to a recurring gag about Tom's vanity and his complicated feelings about a child who does not reflect well on him. But the joke, played repeatedly across the show's run, contains within it a real family dynamic about parental expectation and the way children can feel the weight of being seen as a disappointment. Jake Tucker is a child whose father makes his discomfort with his son's appearance visible in a way that is presented as humor, but that represents a specific kind of parental failure that the show never quite acknowledges as such. Mort Goldman was a nervous pharmacist, perpetually anxious, perpetually slightly condescending about the health decisions of his customers, perpetually present at the edges of events that he was never quite the protagonist of. He died in the season 9 premiere, a canonical death that was acknowledged and honored. His wife Muriel died in the same episode. Their son Neil, who had a persistent unrequited crush on Meg throughout the show's earlier seasons, has continued to appear in subsequent episodes as a kind of young man adrift, having lost both parents in a single night in circumstances that were never particularly examined from his perspective. Neil Goldman is a character who experienced devastating parental loss in a mass casualty event, and the show has never found more than a passing interest in what that experience cost him. Mayor Adam West, played by the actual Adam West until his death in 2017, represented one of the show's most sustained pieces of casting absurdity, and the decision to have him play a character with his own name but an entirely different personality is worth thinking about. Adam West, the actor, was known for playing Batman in the iconic 1960s television series, a role defined by earnest heroism and a kind of unironic dignity. Adam West, The mayor is a character defined by his detachment from conventional reality, his non sequiturs, his willingness to pursue irrelevant interests with the same conviction most people bring to urgent ones. The casting choice took the persona most associated with Adam West and replaced it with its exact opposite, and then had that opposite persona hold civic authority in a fictional town for years. What does it mean to be mayor of a place when the mayor operates on a logic that the place does not share? What does it mean to have power when your understanding of what the power is for is entirely unrelated to what the people you have power over understand it to be for? Mayor West, played with total commitment by Adam West, is a walking meditation on these questions that the show never poses directly but embeds in every scene he is in. Bruce, the gentle recurring character who appears in various episodes, in various roles, is one of the show's most reliably comforting background presences. He is always kind. He is always slightly melancholy in a way that reads less as depression and more as a kind of innate gentleness in a world that does not always make room for gentleness. He appears at moments that need a particular quality of soft presence, and he provides it consistently across seasons and episodes and context. He is not a mystery, he is a constant. And constants, in a show full of instability and reversals and resets, are their own kind of gift. Consuela the cleaning woman is one of the show's most deliberately simple recurring jokes, a character whose defining characteristic is an unwillingness to do things that are inconvenient. She says no. She resists. She declines to accommodate requests that she finds burdensome without offering explanations or apologies. In a show full of characters who perform elaborate justifications for their behavior, Consuela's refusal to justify herself is, in its own way, the most straightforwardly honest mode of relating to the world that any character in the show demonstrates. She knows what she is willing to do, and she does not do the other things. The simplicity of this is presented as a joke, but simplicity of purpose is not actually funny. It is admirable. The show cannot quite decide whether it knows this. Section 20. What remains when the episode ends? There is a particular quality to the end of a Family Guy episode that differs from the end of most animated comedies. Most episodes end somewhere definitive, a resolution, a lesson, a return to a stable state that is functionally identical to the state that existed before the episode began. The floating timeline ensures this. Whatever happened during the episode, the next episode will find everyone where they were. But the endings of the best Family Guy episodes have a quality of residue, something that does not fully resolve. The humor lands, but the weight of what generated the humor lingers in the room after the credits roll. The Brian and Stewie Vault episode ends with the two of them back in the world, having said what they said and heard what they heard. And the episode makes no claim that this changes anything. They are back. The gun is still in the vault. The things that were true before the conversation are still true after it. The hurricane episode ends with Meg where she started, the family dynamics restored to their familiar shape, and the show offering no comfort beyond the cold comfort of systems that persist. The chicken fight episodes end with Peter walking away battered and Ernie alive in the wreckage. Not a conclusion, but a pause in something that continues. This quality of unresolved residue is not a flaw. It is, in fact, one of the most honest things about the show. Real situations rarely resolve cleanly. Real relationships rarely reach the moment where all the accounts are balanced, and the emotional math adds up. What you get instead is continuation. The next episode. The next day. The next conversation at the bar. The show keeps going because the show has always been about going. Not arriving, not resolving, going, and the specific texture of what it feels like to be in the middle of a life that does not sort itself neatly into episodes with clear beginnings and endings. 31 Spooner Street is still lit up tonight. The television is on somewhere inside it. The dog is probably in his room with a drink. The baby is probably in his crib, staring at the ceiling, running the calculations on something none of us can imagine. The big man is on the couch, laughing at something on the screen, and his wife is beside him, and the kids are somewhere in the house, and the neighbors are next door and across the street. And the bar is still open on the corner, and the lights of the fictional Rhode Island city stretch out in every direction into a darkness that is not threatening, but is simply the ordinary darkness of a night in a town where most of the stories have been told, but none of them are quite finished. You have been here long enough. You know this neighborhood now. Let it keep going without you for a little while. Let the questions rest. Let the mysteries stay mysterious. Let the lights of Spooner Street grow dim the way they do every night, and let whatever comes next be whatever comes next. You have been here, that is enough. Sleep well. Thank you for spending this time here. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to Uncle Guy Lore for more deep dives into the shows and worlds that deserve this kind of attention. Drop a comment telling us where you are and what time it is. We read every one. We will see you in the next one. Uncle Guy Lore, fall asleep to every mystery in Family Guy Complete Script. Section 21. The complete inventory of things we never found out. Every long-running television show accumulates a list of things it introduced and never finished. These are not plot holes. They are something different from that. A plot hole is a contradiction, an inconsistency, a moment where the internal logic of a story breaks down. What we are talking about is subtler. These are the things the show pointed at and then looked away from. The things it placed in the frame and then moved the camera away before you could see them fully. The deliberate incompletions that stay with you after the show has ended for the night. We have covered many of them across the previous sections, but it seems right, here near the end of this long, quiet journey through the world of Spooner Street, to assemble them in one place. Not to solve them, not to analyze them further, just to hold them together, to feel the shape of the list, to acknowledge that these open ends are themselves a portrait of a show that lived long enough to leave things behind. We never found out who was driving the car that killed Brian Griffin. In the original timeline before Stewie went back to prevent it, the car is still out there in whatever version of the timeline existed before the intervention. The driver went home, got on with their life, does not know what they almost permanently removed from the world. We never found out what is in Brian's safety deposit box at this point. Whether the gun is still there, whether he has ever gone back to it, whether Stewie's act of saving his life changed his relationship with that particular piece of metal in a room somewhere. We never found out what happened to Brian's son, Dylan, after the episode that established their relationship and then quietly retired him from the recurring cast. Dylan exists somewhere in the show's world growing up, carrying the particular complexity of having been found by a father who was glad to find him. We never found out the contents of Brian's novel, the one that has been in progress for the show's entire run. The one that has been finished and lost and started over and despaired of, and briefly replaced by the self-help book and then returned to, always returned to, because a person who needs to write cannot quite stop needing to write even when the need costs them everything. We never found out exactly what Stewie knew about his own cosmic significance, whether he understood that his existence was necessary for the universe to persist, whether that knowledge would have changed him, whether the baby who wanted to take over the world knew that in some sense he already had. We never found out what the inside of Herbert's house looks like. We have seen the outside. We have seen Herbert emerge from it in various episodes. The inside remains unseen. Whatever is in there, whatever the accumulated history of that house contains, the show has never let a camera through the door. We never found out what Mayor Adam West truly believed, whether his detachment from conventional reality was a performance or a genuine mode of experiencing the world, whether there was a different man underneath the behavior that the camera always caught, or whether what the camera caught was all of him. We never found out what Lois's adult film actually contains, whether it is the kind of thing you would expect or something more unexpected, whether the Joyce Kinney revelation was the only time it was screened, or whether it had other screenings the show did not follow. We never found out what Bonnie Swanson was thinking during those 8 years of pregnancy, whether the inexplicably extended gestation was a source of private suffering or merely of practical inconvenience, whether somewhere in those years she had moments where she sat with the not yet born Susie and talked to her, told her things about the world she was waiting to enter. We never found out what happened to Meg's possible other father, whether the implication left in that season 3 episode was a real thread or an accidental one, whether somewhere in the world a man exists who does not know he might have a daughter growing up in a household that treats her in the ways it does. We never found out the complete history of the house at 31 Spooner Street before the Griffins. The house predates them. Houses always do. Someone else slept in those rooms. Someone else watched television from that couch. Someone else looked at those mountain paintings without knowing they depicted a mountain called Mount Quahog, without knowing that a baby genius would one day name the mountain from a crib 60 feet away. We never found out what the world would look like if even one of Stewie's early plans had succeeded. The show told us, in the two-parter, that it would look like domination achieved and a mother still alive and complicated. But that was a simulation. The actual consequences, played out without the safety net of a reset, remain hypothetical. The universe where Stewie won has never been shown. We never found out what the Drunken Clam looked like in its earliest days, before it was St. Elmo's Clam, before any of the current regulars needed a bar to be regular at. The bar is old enough to have a history that precedes all of them, and that history is underrated. We never found out how Ernie the Giant Chicken came to be, whether there are others like him, whether the Society of Giant Chickens that his later episodes reveal is a widespread phenomenon or a local anomaly, whether in some part of this world there is a community of giant talking chickens going about their lives with the same mixture of domestic ordinariness and occasional supernatural resilience that Ernie demonstrates. We never found out what Stewie will be when he grows up, the actual version. The one that is not a simulation or a cutaway, but the actual future of a child who is 1 year old and cosmically necessary and in possession of technology that should not exist in the time period it exists in. The show has never been willing to commit to a canonical adult Stewie, and perhaps that is right. Perhaps some futures should stay potential. We never found out why Brian can speak. The show has never explained the mechanism. He simply can. The gap between his speaking dog nature and the non-speaking dog nature of every other dog in the show's world is total and unexplained. Something made Brian different. That something is not named. We never found out whether the Griffin family will be okay. This one sounds like it should not be on a list of unanswered mysteries, because it is a feeling rather than a fact. But the question of whether they will be okay is the one that the show has circled for over 25 years without committing to an answer. They have been broken and reassembled so many times. They have hurt each other in ways that the show has sometimes acknowledged and sometimes pretended away. They have also, in the moments the show has been willing to give them, loved each other with a specificity and a warmth that the comedy does not diminish. Whether the Griffins will be okay is a question that the show refuses to answer, because to answer it would be to end it. And the show has decided, for various reasons, that it is not yet willing to end. Every season they return. Every episode they are more or less where they were. The question stays open. Open is not a bad thing for a question to be. Open means the possibility of yes is still present. Open means the story is not finished. Open means that tomorrow, when the television comes on and the familiar theme music plays and the familiar street appears, the family will still be there, still living in the house that technically does not exist on any official map, still figuring it out, still carrying what they carry, still lit by the specific quality of light that belongs to a Tuesday evening in a town that cannot receive mail. Still here, still yours, if you want them. They are here. You can come back whenever you want. The house is always lit. The questions are always waiting. The mystery is never gone. Close your eyes now. Let Spooner Street go quiet. We will be here when you wake up. Subscribe to Uncle Guy Lore. Drop a comment from wherever you are. Every message finds us. Every voice matters. We will see you in the next one. Section 22. The Extended Griffin Family and its Buried Connections. Peter Griffin did not arrive in Rhode Island without a history, and that history is populated with characters and relationships that the show has only intermittently explored. His mother Thelma, who narrates the family history episode from inside the panic room, is a woman with a life that extends well beyond the scenes the show grants her. She raised Peter in a household that was never described as particularly nurturing, with a husband who was not his biological father, and who made his difficulty with Peter visible in their interactions. Thelma is warm in ways that Frances never was, but her warmth operated within the constraints of a marriage that defined the household's emotional temperature. She loved her son. She also stayed with the man who was hard on her son. These two things coexisted in her, the way many contradictions coexist in people who have made irreversible decisions and built lives around them. Peter's relationship with his extended family has been explored in episodes that reveal a network of cousins, aunts, uncles, and ancestral connections that occasionally surface to create complications in his current life. The family history that Thelma narrates is not merely an ancestral curiosity. It is the explanation for why the Griffin household operates the way it does, why Peter's specific combination of impulsiveness and occasional surprising grace is not random, but is instead the latest expression of a trait that has been appearing in this family line across centuries of history. Lois's family connections beyond Carter and Babs include a brother, the already discussed Patrick, and presumably a range of cousins and extended family members who exist in the Pewterschmidt network, but rarely appear in the show. The wealth of the Pewterschmidts implies a social world of considerable size and complexity, a world of old money relationships and obligations, and the particular social performances that come with maintaining a family's standing across generations. Lois grew up in this world. She carries it with her in ways she does not always acknowledge. The reflexes of a certain kind of upbringing that do not disappear simply because she moved to a different kind of house. The contrast between the Griffin and Pewterschmidt family cultures is one of the show's most consistently interesting structural elements, even when it is not being directly addressed. The Griffins are chaotic, impulsive, loud, and motivated by immediate desire rather than long-term strategy. The Pewterschmidts are controlled, deliberate, strategic, and motivated by the maintenance of what they already have. The marriage of Peter and Lois is, in cultural terms, a collision between these two approaches to life. And the fact that it has produced a household that is neither one thing nor the other is a piece of characterization that the show has built in rather than declared. Meg and Chris represent the next generation of this collision. They are not Griffins in the chaotic mold, not entirely. They are also not Pewterschmidts in the controlled one. They are something in between, shaped by a household that contains both influences without resolving them. What they eventually become, the adults they grow into, beyond the perpetual adolescence that the show's floating timeline assigns them, is one of the more poignant unknowns of the show's world. These are people whose adult selves exist just beyond the edge of what the camera will show us. Stewie's development within this family environment raises questions that the show typically resolves through the mechanism of his exceptional nature. He is too extraordinary for normal family dynamics to apply. But occasionally, the show allows the family dynamics to touch him anyway, allows him to want something from his parents that his extraordinary nature cannot provide for itself, allows the brilliant infant to be simply an infant for a moment, wanting what infants want. These moments are rare and quickly reclaimed by the comedy, but they are the most honest moments the character ever gets. The family as a unit has survived things that should have ended it. Revelations that would, in a different kind of story, require a reckoning. The adult film, the institutionalized serial killer sibling, the biological father in Ireland, the possible question of Meg's parentage, the accumulated weight of years of behavior that the show acknowledges was damaging and then resets. The Griffins absorb these things and continue, not because they have processed them or resolved them or grown through them in any clean way, because they are a family and families continue even when the reasons for continuing are not entirely clear. This persistence is the show's most fundamental statement about its subject. Family does not require resolution. It requires presence. It requires the willingness to return. The Griffin family returns to each other every episode, battered by whatever the previous half hour put them through, and they continue. The house is still there, the couch is still there, the mountain paintings are on the wall. The baby is in his crib, the dog is in his room, the man is on the couch, his wife is beside him. This is what we come back to watch. Not the adventures, not the cutaways, not the elaborate set pieces. We come back to watch a family that is fundamentally undestroyable, not because it is strong, but because it keeps returning to itself over and over, regardless of what has been done to it. That is the deepest mystery of Family Guy. Not any of the specific questions we have asked tonight, though they are all worth asking. The deepest mystery is why this particular family, with all its damage and all its history and all its unanswered questions, keeps feeling like home. And the answer, if there is one, is that this is what home is. Not the place where everything is resolved, the place where you keep coming back. Sleep well. Wherever you are, drop that comment, hit subscribe, and we will be here. A final note on the world we visited tonight. There is something worth saying about the act of paying close attention to a show like this, about spending hours in the company of a fictional world, and treating it with the seriousness that we have treated it tonight. Some people would say this kind of attention is wasted on a cartoon. That the mysteries of a primetime animated comedy do not deserve the consideration we have given them. That the questions are not really questions, but are simply the spaces between jokes, gaps in the fabric where the writers did not bother to weave all the way to the edge. We disagree with this. Not because every animated comedy deserves this treatment, but because Family Guy, whatever its considerable flaws, has been something more than a joke delivery system for over 25 years. It has been a place where people have found themselves reflected in unexpected ways, where the talking dog's longing felt more recognizable than it should, where the baby's genius and isolation and complicated love for his mother said something true about the experience of feeling simultaneously exceptional and unheard, where the big, loud man's genuine love for his genuinely complicated family said something true about how love and damage can coexist in the same person at the same time. The questions we asked tonight are real questions, the kind that a story plants in you when it has been honest about something. The unresolved threads are real threads. the kind that stories accumulate when they have been running long enough to outgrow any single person's ability to hold all of them at once. The mysteries are real mysteries, not because the show is a mystery in the conventional sense, but because 25 years of a fictional world is long enough to produce genuine depth, genuine history, genuine characters who have become more than their original descriptions. You know these people now, not as well as you know real people, but in the specific way that fictional people become known, through accumulated hours of presence in their world, through the patient attention that reveals what the surface does not immediately show. Spooner Street is dark now. The show has ended, at least for tonight. The television is off. The house is quiet. Take that with you into sleep. The quiet of a street that has held everything you spent tonight thinking about, that has been there through every mystery and every question and every unanswered thread, that will still be there tomorrow, patient as a painting of a mountain that took 17 years to be named. Sleep. The street will keep, and so will you.